Chapter 19 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nemo. Richard III. Richard III may be considered as properly a stage play. It belongs to the theatre rather than to the closet. We shall therefore criticize it chiefly with a reference to the manner in which we have seen it performed. It is the character in which Garrick came out. It was the second character in which Mr. Kean appeared, and in which he acquired his fame. Shakespeare we have always with us, actors we have only for a few seasons, and therefore some account of them may be acceptable, if not to our contemporaries, to those who come after us, if that rich and idle personage, posterity, should deign to look into our writings. It is possible to form a higher conception of the character of Richard than that given by Mr. Kean, but we cannot imagine any character represented with greater distinctness and precision, more perfectly articulated in every part. Perhaps indeed there is too much of what is technically called execution. When we first saw the celebrated actor in the part, we thought he sometimes failed from an exuberance of manner, and dissipated the impression of the general character by the variety of his resources. To be complete, his delineation of it should have more solidity, depth, sustained and impassioned feeling, with somewhat less brilliancy, with fewer glancing lights, pointed transitions, and pantomimic evolutions. The Richard of Shakespeare is towering and lofty, equally impetuous and commanding, haughty, violent, and subtle, bold and treacherous, confident in his strength as well as in his cunning, raised high by his birth and higher by his talents and his crimes, a royal usurper, a princely hypocrite, a tyrant, and a murderer of the house of Plantagenet. But I was born so high, our eyrie buildeth in the cedar's top, and dallies with the wind, and scorns the sun. The idea conveyed in these lines, which are indeed omitted in the miserable medley acted for Richard III., is never lost sight of by Shakespeare, and should not be out of the actor's mind for a moment. The restless and sanguinary Richard is not a man striving to be great, but to be greater than he is. Conscious of his strength of will, his power of intellect, his daring courage, his elevated station, and making use of these advantages to commit unheard of crimes, and to shield himself from remorse and infamy. If Mr. Kean does not entirely succeed in concentrating all the lines of the character, as drawn by Shakespeare, he gives an animation, vigor, and relief to the part which we have not seen equalled. He is more refined than Cook, more bold, varied, and original than Kemble in the same character. In some parts he is deficient in dignity, and particularly in the scenes of state business he has by no means an air of artificial authority. There is at times an aspiring elevation, an enthusiastic rapture in his expectations of attaining the crown, and at others a gloating expression of sullen delight, as if he already clenched the bauble and held it in his grasp. The courtship scene with Lady Anne is an admirable exhibition of smooth and smiling villainy. The progress of wily adulation, of encroaching humility, is finally marked by his action, voice, and eye. He seems, like the first tempter, to approach his prey, secure the event, and, as if success had smoothed his way before him. The late Mr. Cook's manner of representing the scene was more vehement, hurried, and full of anxious uncertainty. This, though more natural in general, was less in character in this particular instance. Richard should woo less as a lover than as an actor, to show his mental superiority and power of making others the playthings of his purposes. Mr. Kean's attitude in leaning against the side of the stage before he comes forward to address Lady Anne is one of the most graceful and striking ever witnessed on the stage. It would do for Titian to paint. the frequent and rapid transition of his voice from the expression of the fiercest passion to the most familiar tones of conversation was that which gave a peculiar grace of novelty to his acting on his first appearance. This has been since imitated and caricatured by others, and he himself uses the artifice more sparingly than he did. His by-play is excellent. His manner of bidding his friends good night, after pausing with the point of his sword drawn slowly backward and forward on the ground, as if considering the plan of the battle next day, is a particularly happy and natural thought. He gives to the two last acts of the play the greatest animation and effect. He fills every part of the stage, and makes up for the deficiency of his person by what he has been sometimes objected to as an excess of action. The concluding scene, in which he is killed by Richmond, is the most brilliant of the whole. He fights at last like one drunk with wounds, and the attitude in which he stands with his hands stretched out after his sword is wrested from him has a preternatural and terrific grandeur, as if his will could not be disarmed, and the very phantoms of his despair had power to kill. Mr. Kean has since in a great measure effaced the impression of his Richard III. By the superior efforts of his genius in Othello, his masterpiece, in the murder scene in Macbeth, in Richard II., in Sir Giles Overreach, and lastly in Oroonoko. But we still like to look back to his first performance of this part, both because it first assured his admirers of his future success, and because we bore our feeble but, at that time, not useless testimony to the merits of this very original actor, on which the town was considerably divided for no other reason than because they were original. The manner in which Shakespeare's plays have been generally altered or rather mangled by modern mechanists is a disgrace to the English stage. The patchwork Richard III., which is acted under the sanction of his name, and which was manufactured by Cibber, is a striking example of this remark. The play itself is undoubtedly a very powerful effusion of Shakespeare's genius. The groundwork of the character of Richard, the mixture of intellectual vigor with moral depravity, in which Shakespeare delighted to show his strength, gave full scope as well as temptation to the exercise of his imagination. The character of his hero is almost everywhere predominant, and marks its lurid track throughout. The original play is, however, too long for representation, and there are some few scenes which might be better spared than preserved, and by omitting which it would remain a complete whole. The only rule indeed for altering Shakespeare is to retrench certain passages which may be considered either superfluous or obsolete, but not to add or transpose anything. The arrangement and development of the story, and the mutual contrast and combination of the dramatis personae, are in general as finely managed as the development of the characters or the expression of the passions. This rule has not been adhered to in the present instance. Some of the most important and striking passages in the principal character have been omitted, to make room for idle and misplaced extracts from other plays, the only intention of which seems to have been to make the character of Richard as odious and disgusting as possible. It is apparently for no other purpose than to make Gloucester stab King Henry on the stage, that the fine, abrupt introduction of the character in the opening of the play is lost in the tedious, whining morality of the uxorious king, taken from another play. We say tedious because it interrupts the business of the scene, and loses its beauty and effect by having no intelligible connection with the previous character of the mild, well-meaning monarch. The passages which the unfortunate Henry has to recite are beautiful and pathetic in themselves, but they have nothing to do with the world that Richard has to bustle in. In the same spirit of vulgar caricature is the scene between Richard and Lady Anne, when his wife, interpolated without any authority, merely to gratify this favourite propensity to disgust and loathing. With the same perverse consistency, Richard, after his last fatal struggle, is raised up by some galvanic process to utter the imprecation without any motive but pure malignity, which Shakespeare has so properly put into the mouth of Northumberland on hearing of Percy's death. To make room for these worse than needless additions, many of the most striking passages in the real play have been omitted by the foppery and ignorance of the prompt book critics. We do not mean to insist merely on passages which are fine as poetry and to the reader, such as Clarence's dream, etc., but on those which are important to the understanding of the character, and peculiarly adapted for stage effect. We will give the following as instances among several others. The first is the scene where Richard enters abruptly to the Queen and her friends to defend himself. Gloucester. They do me wrong, and I will not endure it. Who are they that complain unto the King, that I forsooth am stern, and love them not? By holy Paul, that I love his grace but lightly, that fill his ears with such dissentious rumours, because I cannot flatter and look fair, smile in men's faces, smooth, deceive, and cog, duck with French nods and apish courtesy, I must be held a rancorous enemy. Cannot a plain man live and think no harm, but thus his simple truth must be abused with silken, sly, insinuating jacks? Gray. To whom in all this presence speaks your grace? Gloucester. To thee, that hast nor honesty nor grace. When have I injured thee? When done thee wrong? Or thee, or any of your faction? A plague upon you all! Nothing can be more characteristic than the turbulent pretensions to meekness and simplicity in this address. Again, the versatility and adroitness of Richard is admirably described in the following ironical conversation with Brakenbury. Brakenbury. I beseech your graces both to pardon me. His Majesty hath straitly given in charge that no man shall have private conference of what degree soever with your brother. Gloucester. E'en so, and please your worship, Brakenbury, you may partake of anything we say. We speak no treason, man. We say the King is wise and virtuous, and his noble Queen well strook in years, fair and not jealous. We say that Shore's wife hath a pretty foot, a cherry lip, a bonny eye, a passing pleasing tongue, that the Queen's kindred are made gentlefolks. How say you, sir? Can you deny all this? Brakenbury. With this, my lord, myself have naught to do. Gloucester. What, fellow, naught to do with Mistress Shore? I tell you, sir, he that doth naught with her, excepting one, were best to do it secretly alone. Brakenbury. What one, my lord? Gloucester. Her husband, knave! Wouldst thou betray me? The feigned reconciliation of Gloucester with the Queen's kinsman is also a masterpiece, one of the finest strokes in the play, and which serves to show as much as anything the deep, plausible manners of Richard, is the unsuspecting security of Hastings, at the very time when the former is plotting his death, and when the very appearance of cordiality and good humour, on which Hastings builds his confidence, arises from Richard's consciousness of having betrayed him to his ruin. This, with the whole character of Hastings, is omitted. Perhaps the two most beautiful passages in the original play are the farewell apostrophe of the Queen to the Tower, where the children are shut up from her, and Tyrrell's description of their death. We will finish our quotations with them. Queen. Stay, yet look back with me unto the Tower. Pity, you ancient stones, those tender babes, whom envy hath immured within your walls. Rough cradle for such little pretty ones, rude, rugged nurse, old sullen playfellow for tender princes. The other passage is the account of their death by Tyrrell. Dighton and Forest, whom I did suborn to do this piece of ruthless butchery, albeit They were fleshed villains, bloody dogs, wept like two children in their death's sad story. "Oh, thus," quoth Dighton, "lay the gentle babes, thus, thus," quoth Forrest, girdling one another within their innocent alabaster arms. Their lips were four red roses on a stalk, and in that summer beauty kissed each other. A book of prayers on their pillow lay. "Which one," quoth Forrest, "almost changed my mind." But, oh, the devil! There the villains stopped. When Dighton thus told on, we smothered the most replenished sweet work of nature that from the prime creation e'er she framed. These are some of those wonderful bursts of feeling, done to the life, to the very height of fancy and nature, which our Shakespeare alone could give. We do not insist on the repetition of these last passages as proper for the stage. We should indeed be loath to trust them in the mouth of almost any actor, but we should wish them to be retained in preference at least to the Fantoccini exhibition of the young princes, Edward and York, bandying childish wit with their uncle. End of Richard III. Chapter 20 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nemo. Henry VIII. This play contains little action or violence of passion, yet it has considerable interest of a more mild and thoughtful cast, and some of the most striking passages in the author's works. The character of Queen Catherine is the most perfect delineation of matronly dignity, sweetness, and resignation that can be conceived. Her appeals to the protection of the king, her remonstrances to the cardinal, her conversations with her women, show a noble and generous spirit, accompanied with the utmost gentleness of nature. What can be more affecting than her answer to Campias and Wolsey, who come to visit her as pretended friends? "Nay, forsooth, my friends, they that must weigh out my afflictions, they that my trust must grow to, live not here. They are, as all my comforts are, far hence, in mine own country, lords." Dr. Johnson observes of this play, that the meek sorrows and virtuous distress of Catherine have furnished some scenes which may be justly numbered among the greatest efforts of tragedy. But the genius of Shakespeare comes in and goes out with Catherine. Every other part may be easily conceived and easily written. This is easily said, but with all due deference to so great a reputed authority as that of Johnson, it is not true. For instance, the scene of Buckingham led to execution is one of the most affecting and natural in Shakespeare, and one to which there is hardly an approach in any other author. Again, the character of Wolsey, the description of his pride and of his fall, are inimitable, and have, besides their gorgeousness of effect, a pathos which only the genius of Shakespeare could lend to the distresses of a proud bad man like Wolsey. There is a sort of childlike simplicity in the very helplessness of his situation, arising from the recollection of his past overbearing ambition. After the cutting sarcasms of his enemies on his disgrace, against which he bears up with a spirit conscious of his own superiority, he breaks out into that fine apostrophe: "Farewell, a long farewell to all my greatness. This is the state of man. To-day he puts forth the tender leaves of hope, to-morrow blossoms, and bears his blushing honours thick upon him. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost, and, when he thinks, good easy man, full surely his greatness is a-ripening, nips his root, and then he falls, as I do. I have ventured, like little wanton boys that swim on bladders, these many summers in a sea of glory. But far beyond my depth, my high-blown pride at length broke under me, and now has left me, weary and old with service, to the mercy of a rude stream that must forever hide me. Vain pomp and glory of the world, I hate ye. I feel my heart new opened. Oh, how wretched is that poor man that hangs on princes' favours! There's betwixt that smile we would aspire to, that sweet aspect of princes and our ruin, more pangs and fears than worn women have, and when he falls like Lucifer, never to hope again. There is in this passage, as well as in the well-known dialogue with Cromwell which follows, something which stretches beyond commonplace, nor is the account which Griffiths gives of Wolsey's death less Shakespearean, and the candour with which Queen Catherine listens to the praise of him whom of all men while living she hated most, adds the last graceful finishing to her character. Among other images of great individual beauty might be mentioned the description of the effect of Anne Boleyn's presenting herself to the crowd at her coronation. While her Grace sat down to rest awhile, some half an hour or so, in a rich chair of state, opposing freely the beauty of her person to the people. Believe me, sir, she is the goodliest of women that ever lay by man, which, when the people had the full view of, such a noise arose as the shrouds make at sea in a stiff tempest, as loud and to as many tunes. The character of Henry VIII is drawn with great truth and spirit. It is like a very disagreeable portrait sketched by the hand of a master. His gross appearance, his blustering demeanour, his vulgarity, his ignorance, his sensuality, his cruelty, his hypocrisy, his want of common decency and common humanity, are marked in strong lines. His traditional peculiarities of expression complete the reality of the picture. The authoritative expletive "ha!" with which he intimates his indignation or surprise has an effect like the first startling sound that breaks from a thundercloud. He is of all the monarchs in our history the most disgusting, for he unites in himself all the vices of barbarism and refinement, without their virtues. Other kings before him, such as Richard III., were tyrants and murderers out of ambition or necessity. They gained or established unjust power by violent means. They destroyed there or made its tenure insecure. But Henry VIII's power is most fatal to those whom he loves. He is cruel and remorseless to pamper his luxurious appetites, bloody and voluptuous, an amorous murderer, an uxorious debauchee. His hardened insensibility to the feelings of others is strengthened by the most profligate self-indulgence. The religious hypocrisy, under which he masks his cruelty and his lust, is admirably displayed in the speech in which he describes the first misgivings of his conscience and its increasing throes and terrors which have induced him to divorce his queen. The only thing in his favour in this play is his treatment of Cranmer. There is also another circumstance in his favour, which is his patronage of Hans Holbein. It has been said of Shakespeare, no maid could live near such a man. It might, with as good reason, be said, no king could live near such a man. His eye would have penetrated through the pomp of circumstance and the veil of opinion. As it is, he has represented such persons to the life. His plays are in this respect the glass of history. He has done them the same justice as if he had been a privy councillor all his life, and in each successive reign. Kings ought never to be seen upon the stage. In the abstract, they are very disagreeable characters. It is only while living that they are the best of kings. It is their power, their splendor. It is the apprehension of the personal consequences of their favor or their hatred that dazzles the imagination and suspends the judgment of their favorites or their vassals. But death cancels the bond of allegiance and of interest, and seen as they were, their power and their pretensions look monstrous and ridiculous. The charge brought against modern philosophy as inimical to loyalty is unjust because it might as well be brought lover of kings. We have often wondered that Henry VIII, as he is drawn by Shakespeare, and as we have seen him represented in all the bloated deformity of mind and person, is not hooted from the English stage. End of Henry VIII. Chapter 21 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nemo and Eva Davis. King John. King John is the last of the historical plays we shall have to speak of, and we are not sorry that it is. If we are to indulge our imaginations, we had rather do it upon an imaginary theme. If we are to find subjects for the exercise of our pity and terror, we prefer seeking them in fictitious danger and fictitious distress. It gives a soreness to our feelings of indignation or sympathy when we know that in tracing the progress of sufferings and crimes we are treading upon real ground, and recollect that the poet's dream denoted a foregone conclusion, irrevocable ills, not conjured up by fancy, but placed beyond the reach of poetical justice. That the treachery of King John, the death of Arthur, the grief of Constance had a real truth in history, sharpens the sense of pain, while it hangs a leaden weight on the heart and the imagination. Something whispers us that we have no right to make a mock of calamities like these, or to turn the truth of things into the puppet and plaything of our fancies. To consider thus may be to consider too curiously, but still we think that the actual truth of the particular events, in proportion as we are conscious of it, is a drawback on the pleasure as well as the dignity of tragedy. King John has all the beauties of language and all the richness of the imagination to relieve the painfulness of the subject. The character of King John himself is kept pretty much in the background. It is only marked in by comparatively slight indications. The crimes he is tempted to commit are such as are thrust upon him rather by circumstances and opportunity than of his own seeking. He is here represented as more cowardly than cruel, and as more contemptible than odious. The play embraces only a part of his history. There are, however, few characters on the stage that excite more disgust and loathing. He has no intellectual grandeur or strength of character to shield him from the indignation which his immediate conduct provokes. He stands naked and defenceless in that respect, to the worst we can think of him, and besides, we are impelled to put the very worst construction on his meanness and cruelty by the tender picture of the beauty and helplessness of the object of it, as well as by the frantic and heart-rending pleadings of maternal despair. We do not forgive him the death of Arthur because he had too late revoked his doom and tried to prevent it, and perhaps because he has himself repented of his black design. Our moral sense gains courage to hate him the more for it. We take him at his word, and think his purposes must be odious indeed, when he himself shrinks back from them. The scene in which King John suggests to Hubert the design of murdering his nephew is a masterpiece of dramatic skill, but it is still inferior, very inferior, to the scene between Hubert and Arthur, when the latter learns the orders to put out his eyes. If anything ever was penned, heart-piercing, mixing the extremes of terror and pity, of that which shocks and that which soothes the mind, it is this scene. We will give it entire, though perhaps it is tasking the reader's sympathy too much. Enter Hubert and Executioner. Hubert. Heat me those irons hot, and look you stand within the arras. When I strike my foot upon the bosom of the ground, rush forth and bind the boy, which you shall find with me, fast to the chair. Be heedful, hence, and watch. Executioner. I hope your warrant will bear out the deed. Hubert. Uncleanly scruples! Fear not you. Look to it. Young lad, come forth. I have to say with you. Enter Arthur. Arthur. Good morrow, Hubert. Hubert. Morrow, little prince. Arthur. As little prince, having so great a title to be more prince, as may be. You are sad. Hubert. Indeed, I have been merrier. Arthur. Mercy on me! Methinks nobody should be sad but I. Yet I remember when I was in France, young gentlemen would be as sad as night, only for wantonness. By my Christendom, so were I out of prison and kept sheep, I should be merry as the day is long, and so I would be here, but that I doubt my uncle practises more harm to me. He is afraid of me, and I of him. Is it my fault that I was Geoffrey's son? Indeed it is not, and I would to heaven I were your son, so you would love me, Hubert. Hubert. If I talk to him with his innocent prate, he will awake my Mercy, which lies dead. Therefore I will be sudden, and dispatch. Aside. Arthur. Are you sick, Hubert? You look pale to-day. In sooth, I would you were a little sick, that I might sit all night and watch with you. Alas! I love you more than you do me. Hubert. His words do take possession of my bosom. Read here, young Arthur, showing a paper. How now, foolish room? Aside. Turning this piteous torture out of door. I must be brief, lest resolution drop out at mine eyes in tender womanish tears. Can you not read it? Is it not fair writ? Arthur. Too fairly, Hubert, for so foul a fact. Must you with irons burn out both mine eyes? Hubert. Young boy, I must. Arthur. And will you? Hubert. And I will. Arthur. Have you the heart? When your head did but ache, I knit my handkerchief about your brows. The best I had, a princess wrought it to me, and I did never ask it you again. And with my hand at midnight held your head, and, like the watchful minutes to the hour, still and anon cheered up the heavy time, saying what lack you, and where lies your grief? Or what good love may I perform for you? Many a poor man's son would have lain still, and ne'er have spoke a loving word to you. But you at your sick service had a prince. Nay, you may think my love was a crafty love, and call it cunning. Do, and if you will, if heaven be pleased that you must use me ill, why then you must. Will you put out mine eyes? These eyes that never did and never shall so much as frown on you. Hubert. I've sworn to do it, and with hot irons must I burn them out. Arthur. Oh, if an angel should have come to me and told me Hubert should put out mine eyes, I would not have believed a tongue but Hubert's. Hubert. Come forth, do as I bid you. Stamps, and the men enter. Arthur. Oh, save me, Hubert, save me. My eyes are out even with the fierce looks of these bloody men. Hubert. Give me the iron, I say, and bind him here. Arthur. Alas, what need you be so boisterous rough? I will not struggle. I will stand stone still. For heaven's sake, Hubert, let me not be bound. Nay, hear me, Hubert. Drive these men away, and I will sit as quiet as a lamb. I will not stir, nor wince, nor speak a word, nor look upon the iron angrily. Thrust but these men away, and I'll forgive you, whatever torment you do put me to. Hubert. Go, stand within, and let me alone with him. Executioner. I am best pleased to be from such a deed. Exit. Arthur. Alas, I then have chid away my friend. He hath a stern look, but a gentle heart. Let him come back, that his compassion may give life to yours. Hubert. Come, boy, prepare yourself. Arthur. Is there no remedy? Hubert. None, but to lose your eyes. Arthur. Oh, heaven, that there were but a mote in yours, a grain, a dust, a gnat, a wandering hair, any annoyance in that precious sense. Then, feeling what small things are boisterous there, your vile intent must needs seem horrible. Hubert. Is this your promise? Go to, hold your tongue. Arthur. Let me not hold my tongue. Let me not, Hubert. Or, Hubert, if you will, cut out my tongue, so I may keep mine eyes. Oh, spare mine eyes, though to no use, but still to look on you. Lo, by my troth, the instrument is cold, and would not harm me. Hubert. I can heat it, boy. Arthur. No, in good sooth, the fire is dead with grief. Being create for comfort to be used in undeserved extremes. See else yourself, there is no malice in this burning coal. The breath of heaven hath blown its spirit out, and strewed repentant ashes on its head. Hubert. But with my breath I can revive it, boy. Arthur. All things that you shall use to do me wrong deny their office, only you do lack that mercy which fierce fire and iron extend, creatures of note for mercy lacking uses. Hubert. Well, see to live. I will not touch thine eyes for all the treasure that thine uncle owns. Yet I am sworn, and I did purpose, boy, with this same very iron to burn them out. Arthur. Oh, now you look like Hubert. All this while you were disguised. Hubert. Peace, no more, adieu. Your uncle must not to know but you are dead. I'll fill these dogs' spies with false reports. And, pretty child, sleep doubtless and secure that Hubert, for the wealth of all the world, will not offend thee. Arthur. Oh, heaven, I thank you, Hubert. Hubert. Silence, no more. Go closely in with me. Much danger do I undergo for thee. Exit. His death afterwards, when he throws himself from his prison walls, excites the utmost pity for his innocence and friendless situation. and well justifies the exaggerated denunciations of Falconbridge to Hubert, whom he suspects wrongfully of the deed. "There's not yet so ugly a fiend of hell as thou shalt be, if thou didst kill this child. If thou didst but consent to this most cruel act, do but despair, and if thou wants a cord, the smallest thread that ever spider twisted from her womb will strangle thee. A rush will be a beam to hang thee on. Or wouldst thou drown thyself? But put a little water in a spoon, and it shall be as all the ocean, enough to stifle such a villain up." The excess of maternal tenderness, rendered desperate by the fickleness of friends and the injustice of fortune, and made stronger in will in proportion to the want of all other power, was never more finely expressed than in Constance. The dignity of her answer to King Philip, when she refuses to accompany his messenger. "To me and to the state of my great grief let kings assemble." Her indignant reproach to Austria for deserting her cause. Her invocation to death, that love of misery, however fine and spirited, all yield to the beauty of the passage where, her passion subsiding into tenderness, she addresses the Cardinal in these words:
"Oh, Father Cardinal, I have heard you say that we shall see and know our friends in heaven. If that be true, I shall see my boy again. For since the birth of Cain, the first male child, to him that did but yesterday suspire, there was not such a gracious creature born. But now will canker sorrow eat my bud, and chase the native beauty from his cheek, and he will look as hollow as a ghost, as dim and meagre as an egg is fit. And so he'll die, and rising so again, when I shall meet him in the court of heaven, I shall not know him. Therefore never, never must I behold my pretty Arthur more."
King Philip. "You are as fond of grief as of your child." Constance.
Grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief.
The contrast between the mild resignation of Queen Catherine to her own wrongs, and the wild, uncontrollable affliction of Constance for the wrongs which she sustains as a mother, is no less naturally conceived than it is ably sustained throughout these two wonderful characters. The accompaniment of the comic character of the bastard was well chosen to relieve the poignant agony of suffering and the cold, cowardly policy of behaviour in the principal characters of this play. Its spirit, invention, volubility of tongue, and forwardness in action are unbounded. "Aliquando sufflaminandis erat," says Ben Jonson of Shakespeare, but we should be sorry if Ben Jonson had been his licenser. We prefer the heedless magnanimity of his wit infinitely to all Jonson's laborious caution. The character of the bastard's comic humour is the same in essence as that of other comic characters in Shakespeare. They always run on with good things and are never exhausted. They are always daring and successful. They have words at will and a flow of wit, like a flow of animal spirits. The difference between Falconbridge and the others is that he is a soldier, and brings his wit to bear upon action, is courageous with his sword as well as tongue, and stimulates his gallantry by his jokes. His enemies, feeling the sharpness of his blows and the sting of his sarcasms at the same time. Among his happiest sallies are his descanting on the composition of his own person, his invective against commodity, tickling commodity, and his expression of contempt for the Archduke of Austria, who had killed his father, which begins in jest but ends in serious earnest. His conduct at the siege of Angiers shows that his resources were not confined to verbal retorts. The same exposure of the policy of courts and camps, of kings, nobles, priests, and cardinals, takes place here as in the other plays we have gone through, and we shall not go into a disgusting repetition. This, like the other plays taken from English history, is written in a remarkably smooth and flowing style, very different from some of the tragedies, Macbeth for instance. The passages consist of a series of single lines, not running into one another. This peculiarity in the versification, which is most common in the three parts of Henry VI, has been assigned as a reason why those plays were not written by Shakespeare, but the same structure of verse occurs in his other undoubted plays, as in Richard II and in King John. The following are instances. That daughter there of Spain, the Lady Blanche, is near to England. Look upon the years of Louis to the Dauphin, and that lovely maid. If lusty love should go in quest of beauty, where should he find it fairer than in Blanche? If zealous love should go in search of virtue, where should he find it purer than in Blanche? If love ambitious sought a match of birth, whose veins bound richer blood than Lady Blanche? Such as she is, in beauty, virtue, birth, is the young Dauphin, every way complete. If not complete of, say he is not she, and she again wants nothing, to name want, if want it be not, that she is not he. He is the half part of a blessed man, left to be finished by such as she, and she a fair divided excellence, whose fullness of perfection lies in him. Oh, two such silver currents, when they join do glorify the banks that bound them in, and two such shores to two such streams made one, two such controlling bounds shall you be kings, to these two princes, if you marry them. Another instance, which is certainly very happy as an example of the simple enumeration of a number of particulars, is Salisbury's remonstrance against the second crowning of the king. Therefore to be possessed with double pomp, to guard a title that was rich before, to gild refined gold, to paint the lily, to throw a perfume on the violet, to smooth the ice, to add another hue unto the rainbow, or with taper light to seek the beauteous eye of heaven to garnish, is wasteful and ridiculous excess. End of King John.
Chapter 22 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Twelfth Night, or What You Will. This is justly considered as one of the most delightful of Shakespeare's comedies. It is full of sweetness and pleasantry. It is perhaps too good-natured for comedy. It has little satire and no spleen. It aims at the ludicrous rather than the ridiculous. It makes us laugh at the follies of mankind, not despise them, and still less bear any ill will towards them. Shakespeare's comic genius resembles the bee rather in its power of extracting sweets from weeds or poisons than in leaving a sting behind it. He gives the most amusing exaggeration of the prevailing foibles of his characters, but in a way that they themselves, instead of being offended at, would almost join in to humor. He rather contrives opportunities for them to show themselves off in the happiest lights than renders them contemptible in the perverse construction of the wit or malice of others. There is a certain stage of society in which people become conscious of their peculiarities and absurdities, affect to disguise what they are, and set up pretensions to what they are not. This gives rise to a corresponding style of comedy, the object of which is to detect the disguises of self-love, and to make reprisals on those preposterous assumptions of vanity, by marking the contrast between the real and the affected character as severely as possible, and denying to those who would impose on us for what they are not, even the merit which they have. This is the comedy of artificial life, of wit and satire, such as we see it in Congreve, Wycherley, Vanbrugh, etc. To this succeeds a state of society from which the same sort of affectation and pretense are banished by a greater knowledge of the world, or by their successful exposure on the stage, and which by neutralizing the materials of comic character, both natural and artificial, leaves no comedy at all, but the sentimental. Such is our modern comedy. There is a period in the progress of manners anterior to both these, in which the foibles and follies of individuals are of nature's planting, not the growth of art or study, in which they are therefore unconscious of them themselves, or care not who knows them, if they can but have their whim out, and in which, as there is no attempt at imposition, the spectators rather receive pleasure from humoring the inclinations of the persons they laugh at, than wish to give them pain by exposing their absurdity. This may be called the comedy of nature, and it is the comedy which we generally find in Shakespeare. Whether the analysis here given be just or not, the spirit of his comedies is evidently quite distinct from that of the authors above mentioned, as it is in its essence the same with that of Cervantes, and also very frequently of Molière, though he was more systematic in his extravagance than Shakespeare. Shakespeare's comedy is of a pastoral and poetical cast. Folly is indigenous to the soil, and shoots out with native, happy, unchecked luxuriance. Absurdity has every encouragement afforded it, and nonsense has room to flourish in. Nothing is stunted by the churlish, icy hand of indifference or severity. The poet runs riot in a conceit and idolizes a quibble. His whole object is to turn the meanest or rudest objects to a pleasurable account. The relish which he has of a pun, or the quaint humour of a low character, does not interfere with the delight with which he describes a beautiful image, or the most refined love. The clown's forced jests do not spoil the sweetness of the character of Viola. The same house is big enough to hold Malvolio, the Countess, Maria, Sir Toby, and Sir Andrew Aguecheek. For instance, nothing can fall much lower than this last character in intellect or morals. Yet how are his weaknesses nursed and dandled by Sir Toby into something high fantastical, when on Sir Andrew's commendation of himself for dancing and fencing, Sir Toby answers, "What dost thou mean? Wherefore are these things hid? Wherefore have these gifts a curtain before them? Are they like to take dust like Mistress Mole's picture? Why dost thou not go to church in a galliard, and come home in a coranto? My very walk should be a jig. I would not so much make water, but in a sink pace. What dost thou mean? Is this a world to hide virtues in? I did think by the excellent constitution of thy leg it was framed under the star of a galliard." How Sir Toby, Sir Andrew, and the clown afterward chirp over their cups. How they rouse the night owl in a catch, able to draw 3 souls out of one weaver. What can be better than Sir Toby's unanswerable answer to Malvolio? Dost thou think, because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale? In a word, the best turn is given to everything instead of the worst. There is a constant infusion of the romantic and enthusiastic, in proportion as the characters are natural and sincere. Whereas, in the more artificial style of comedy, everything gives way to ridicule and indifference, there being nothing left but affectation on one side and incredulity on the other. Much as we like Shakespeare's comedies, we cannot agree with Dr. Johnson that they are better than his tragedies, nor do we like them half so well. If his inclination to comedy sometimes led him to trifle with the seriousness of tragedy, the poetical and impassioned passages are the best parts of his comedies. The great and secret charm of Twelfth Night is the character of Viola. Much as we like catches and cakes and ale, there is something that we like better. We have a friendship for Sir Toby. We patronize Sir Andrew. We have an understanding with the clown, a sneaking kindness for Maria and her rogueries. We feel a regard for Malvolio, and sympathize with his gravity, his smiles, his cross-garters, his yellow stockings, and imprisonment in the stocks. But there is something that excites in us a stronger feeling than all this. It is Viola's confession of her love. Duke.
What's her history?
Viola. A blank, my lord. She never told her love. She let concealment, like a worm in the bud, feed on her damask cheek, She pined in thought, and with a green and yellow melancholy, she sat like Patience on a monument, smiling at grief. Was this not love indeed? We men may say more, swear more, but indeed our shows are more than will. For still we prove much in our vows, but little in our love.
Died thy sister of her love, my boy?
I am all the daughters of my father's house, and all the brothers too, and yet I know not. Shakespeare alone could describe the effect of his own poetry. Oh, it came o'er the ear like the sweet south that breathes upon a bank of violets, stealing and giving odor. What we so much admire here is not the image of Patience on a monument, which has been generally quoted, but the lines before and after it. They give a very echo to the seat where love is throned. How long ago it is since we first learnt to repeat them, and still they vibrate on the heart, like the sounds which the passing wind draws from the trembling strings of a harp left on some desert shore. There are other passages of not less impassioned sweetness. Such is Olivia's address to Sebastian, whom she supposes to have already deceived her in a promise of marriage. Blame not this haste of mine, if you mean well. Now go with me and with this holy man into the chantry by. There before him, and underneath that consecrated roof, plight me the full assurance of your faith, that my most jealous and too doubtful soul may live at peace. We have already said something of Shakespeare's songs. One of the most beautiful of them occurs in this play, with a preface of his own to it. Duke.
O fellow, come, the song we had last night. Mark it, Cesario, it is old and plain. The spinsters and the knitters in the sun and the free maids that weave their thread with bones do use to chaunt it. It is silly sooth, and dallies with the innocence of love, like the old age.
Song. Come away, death, and in sad cypress let me be laid. Fly away, breath, I am slain by a fair cruel maid. My shroud of white stuck on with you, oh prepare it. My part of death no one so true did share it. Not a flower sweet, on my black coffin let there be strown. Not a friend greet my poor corpse where my bones shall be thrown. A thousand sighs to save, lay me where sad true love never find my grave to weep there. Who after this will say that Shakespeare's genius was only fitted for comedy? Yet after reading other parts of this play, and particularly the garden scene where Malvolio picks up the letter, if we were to say that his genius for comedy was less than his genius for tragedy, it would perhaps only prove that our own taste in such matters is more saturnine than mercurial. Enter Maria. Sir Toby. Here comes the little villain. How now, my nettle of India? Maria. Get ye all three into the box tree. Malvolio's coming down this walk. He has been yonder in the sun, practising behaviour to his own shadow this half hour. Observe him, for the love of mockery, for I know this letter will make a contemplative idiot of him. Close, in the name of jesting. Lie thou there, for here comes the trout that must be caught with tickling. They hide themselves. Maria throws down a letter and exit.
Malvolio. 'Tis but fortune, all is fortune. Maria once told me she did affect me, and I have heard herself come thus near, that, should she fancy it, should be one of my complexion. Besides, she uses me with a more exalted respect than any one else that follows her. What should I think on't?
Sir Toby. Here's an overweening rogue. Fabian. Oh, peace. Contemplation makes a rare turkey cock of him. How he jets under his advanced plumes. Sir Andrew. Slight, I could so beat the rogue. Sir Toby. Peace, I say.
To be Count Malvolio.
Sir Toby. Ah, rogue. Sir Andrew. Pistol him, pistol him. Sir Toby. Peace, peace.
There is example for it. The lady of the starchy married the yeoman of the wardrobe.
Sir Andrew. Fire on him, Jezebel. Fabian. Oh, peace! Now he's deeply in. Look how imagination blows him.
Having been 3 months married to her, sitting in my chair of state,
Sir Toby. Oh, for stone bow to hit him in the eye.
calling my officers about me in my branched velvet gown, having come from a day-bed, where I've left Olivia sleeping.
Sir Toby. Fire and brimstone. Fabian. Oh, peace, peace.
Then to have the humour of state, and after a demure travel of regard, telling them I know my place as I would they should do theirs, to ask for my kinsman Toby.
Sir Toby. Bolts and shackles. Fabian. Oh, peace, peace, peace. Now.
7 of my people, with an obedient start, make out for him. I frown the while, perchance wind up my watch, or play with some rich jewel. Toby approaches, curtsies there to me.
Sir Toby. Shall this fellow live? Fabian. Though our silence be drawn from us with cares, yet peace.
I extend my hand to him thus, quenching my familiar smile with an austere regard to control.
Sir Toby. And does not Toby take you a blow of the lips then?
Saying, Cousin Toby, my fortunes having cast me on your niece, give me this prerogative of speech.
Sir Toby. What?
You must amend your drunkenness.
Fabian. Nay, Patience. Oh, we break the sinews of our plot.
Besides, you waste the treasure of your time with a foolish knight.
Sir Andrew. That's me, I warned you.
One Sir Andrew.
Sir Andrew. I knew 'twas I, for many do call me fool.
What employment have we here?
Ticking up the letter. The letter and his comments on it are equally good, if poor Malvolio's treatment afterwards is a little hard. Poetical justice is done in the uneasiness which Olivia suffers on account of her mistaken attachment to Cesario, as her insensibility to the violence of the Duke's passion is atoned for by the discovery of Viola's concealed love of him. End of 12th Night. Chapter 23 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Two Gentlemen of Verona. This is little more than the first outlines of a comedy loosely sketched in. It is the story of a novel dramatized with very little labor or pretension, yet there are passages of high poetical spirit and of inimitable quaintness of humor, which are undoubtedly Shakespeare's. And there is, throughout the conduct of the fable, a careless grace and felicity which marks it for his. One of the editors, we believe Mr. Pope, remarks in a marginal note to the Two Gentlemen of Verona, "It is observable, I know not for what cause, that the style of this comedy is less figurative, and more natural and unaffected than the greater part of this author's, though supposed to be one of the first he wrote. Yet so little does the editor appear to have made up his mind upon this subject, that we find the following note to the very next, the second scene. This whole scene, like many others in these plays, some of which I believe were written by Shakespeare, and others interpolated by the players, is composed of the lowest and most trifling conceits, to be accounted for only by the gross taste of the age he lived in. Papallaut placerent. I wish I had authority to leave them out, but I have done all I could, set a mark of reprobation upon them throughout this edition. It is strange that our fastidious critic should fall so soon from praising to reprobating. The style of the familiar parts of this comedy is indeed made up of conceits. Low they may be for what we know, but then they are not poor, but rich ones. The scene of Lance with his dog, not that in the second, but that in the fourth act, is a perfect treat in the way of farcical drollery and invention. Nor do we think Speed's manner of proving his master to be in love deficient in wit or sense, though the style may be criticized as not simple enough for the modern taste. Valentine. Why, how know you that I am in love? Speed. Marry, by these special marks. First, you have learned, like Sir Proteus, to wreathe your arms like a malcontent, to relish a love song like a robin redbreast, to walk alone like one that had the pestilence, to sigh like a schoolboy that had lost his ABC, to weep like a young wench that had buried her grandam, to fast like one that takes diet, to watch like one that fears robbing, to speak puling like a beggar at Hallowmas. You were wont, when you laughed, to crow like a cock, when you walked, to walk like one of the lions. When you fasted, it was presently after dinner. When you looked sadly, it was for want of money. And now you are metamorphosed with a mistress that when I look on you, I can hardly think you my master. The tender scenes in this play, though not so highly wrought as in some others, have often much sweetness of sentiment and expression. There is something pretty and playful in the conversation of Julia with her maid, when she shows such a disposition to coquetry about receiving the letter from Proteus, and her behaviour afterwards, and her disappointment, when she finds him faithless to his vows, remind us at a distance of Imogen's tender constancy. Her answer to Lucetta, who advises her against following her lover in disguise, is a beautiful piece of poetry. Lucetta, I do not seek to quench your love's hot fire, but qualify the fire's extremest rage, lest it should burn above the bounds of reason. Julia, the more thou damp'st it up, the more it burns. The current that with gentle murmur glides, thou knowest, being stopped, impatiently doth rage. But when his fair course is not hindered, he makes sweet music with the enamelled stones, giving a gentle kiss to every sedge he overtaketh in his pilgrimage. And so by many winding nooks he strays, with willing sport to the wild ocean. Footnote: the river wanders at its own sweet will. Wordsworth. Then let me go, and hinder not my course. I'll be as patient as a gentle stream, and make a pastime of each weary step, till the last step have brought me to my love, and there I'll rest, as after much turmoil, a blessed soul doth in Elysium. If Shakespeare indeed had written only this and other passages in the Two Gentlemen of Verona, he would almost have deserved Milton's praise of him. And sweet as Shakespeare, fancy's child, warbles in his native wood notes wild. But as it is, he deserves rather more praise than this. End of The Two Gentlemen of Verona.
Chapter 24 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Nemo. The Merchant of Venice. This is a play that, in spite of the change of manners and of prejudices, still holds undisputed possession of the stage. Shakespeare's malignant has outlived Mr. Cumberland's benevolent Jew. In proportion as Shylock has ceased to be a popular bugbear, baited with a rabble's curse, he becomes a half-favourite with the philosophical part of the audience, who are disposed to think that Jewish revenge is at least as good as Christian injuries. Shylock is a good hater, a man no less sinned against than sinning. If he carries his revenge too far, yet he has strong grounds for the lodged hate he bears Antonio, which he explains with equal force of eloquence and reason. He seems the depositary of the vengeance of his race, and though the long habit of brooding over daily insults and injuries has crusted over his temper with inveterate misanthropy, and hardened him against the contempt of mankind, this adds but little to the triumphant pretensions of his enemies. There is a strong, quick, and deep sense of justice mixed up with the gall and bitterness of his resentment. The constant apprehension of being burnt alive, plundered, banished, reviled, and trampled on, might be supposed to sour the most forbearing nature, and to take something from that milk of human kindness with which his persecutors contemplated his indignities. The desire of revenge is almost inseparable from the sense of wrong, and we can hardly help sympathizing with the proud spirit hid beneath his Jewish gabardine, stung to madness by repeated undeserved provocations, and laboring to throw off the load of obloquy and oppression heaped upon him and all his tribe by one desperate act of lawful revenge, till the ferociousness of the means by which he is to execute his purpose, and the pertinacity with which he adheres to it, turn us against him. But even at last, when disappointed of the sanguinary revenge with which he had glutted his hopes, and exposed to beggary and contempt by the letter of the law on which he had insisted with so little remorse, we pity him, and think him hardly dealt with by his judges. In all his answers and retorts upon his adversaries, he has the best not only of the argument, but of the question, reasoning on their own principle and practice. They are so far from allowing of any measure of equal dealing, of common justice or humanity between themselves and the Jew, that even when they come to ask a favour of him, and Shylock reminds them that on such a day they spit upon him, another spurned him, another called him dog, and for these courtesies request he'll lend them so much moneys, Antonio, his old enemy, instead of any acknowledgment of the shrewdness and justice of his remonstrance, which would have been preposterous in a respectable Catholic merchant in those times, threatens him with a repetition of the same treatment. I am as like to call thee so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too. After this, the appeal to the Jew's mercy, as if there were any common principle of right and wrong between them, is the rankest hypocrisy, or the blindest prejudice, and the Jew's answer to one of Antonio's friends, who asked him what his pound of forfeit flesh is good for, is irresistible. To bait fish withal. If it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me, and hindered me of 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies, and what's his reason? I'm a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer that a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you and the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, why should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why revenge? The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. The whole of the trial scene, both before and after the entrance of Portia, is a masterpiece of dramatic skill. The legal acuteness, the passionate declamations, the sound maxims of jurisprudence, the wit and irony interspersed in it, the fluctuations of hope and fear in the different persons, and the completeness and suddenness of the catastrophe cannot be surpassed. Shylock, who is his own counsel, defends himself well, and is triumphant on all the general topics that are urged against him, and only fails through a legal flaw. Take the following as an instance. Shylock. What judgment shall I dread, doing no wrong? You have among you many a purchased slave, which, like your asses and your dogs and mules, you use in abject and in slavish part, because you bought them. Shall I say to you, let them be free, marry them to your heirs? Why sweat they under burdens? Let their beds be made as soft as yours, and let their palates be seasoned with such viands. You will answer, the slaves are ours. So do I answer you. The pound of flesh which I demand of him is dearly bought, is mine, and I will have it. If you deny me Fie upon your law! There is no force in the decree of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer, shall I have it? The keenness of his revenge awakes all his faculties, and he beats back all opposition to his purpose, whether grave or gay, whether of wit or argument, with an equal degree of earnestness and self-possession. His characters displayed as distinctly in other less prominent parts of the play, and we may collect from a few sentences the history of his life, his descent and origin, his thrift and domestic economy, his affection for his daughter whom he loves next to his wealth, his courtship, and his first present to Leah his wife. I would not have parted with it, the ring which he first gave her, for a wilderness of monkeys. What a fine Hebraism is implied in this expression. Portia is not a very great favorite with us, neither are we in love with her maid Nerissa. Portia has a certain degree of affectation and pedantry about her, which is very unusual in Shakespeare's women, but which perhaps was a proper qualification for the office of a civil doctor, which she undertakes and executes so successfully. The speech about mercy is very well, but there are 1,000 finer ones in Shakespeare. We do not admire the scene of the caskets, and object entirely to the Black Prince Meroceus. We should like Jessica better if she had not deceived and robbed her father, and Lorenzo if he had not married a Jewess, though he thinks he has a right to wrong a Jew. The dialogue between this newly married couple by moonlight, beginning on such a night, etc., is a collection of classical elegancies. Launcelot, the Jew's man, is an honest fellow. The dilemma in which he describes himself placed between his conscience and the fiend, the one of which advises him to run away from his master's service, and the other to stay in it, is exquisitely humorous. Gratiano is a very admirable subordinate character. He is the jester of the piece, yet one speech of his, in his own defence, contains a whole volume of wisdom. Antonio. I hold the world but as the world, Gratiano, a stage, where every one must play his part, and mine a sad one. Gratiano. Let me play the fool, with mirth and laughter let old wrinkles come, and let my liver rather heat with wine, than my heart cool with mortifying groans. Why should a man, whose blood is warm within, sit like his grandsire cut in alabaster, sleep when he wakes, and creep into the jaundice by being peevish? I tell thee what, Antonio, I love thee, and it is my love that speaks. There are a sort of men whose visages do cream and mantle like a standing pond, and do a wilful stillness entertain, with purpose to be dressed in an opinion of wisdom, gravity, profound conceit, as who should say, I am Sir Oracle, and when I ope my lips let no dog bark. No, my Antonio, I do know of these that therefore only are reputed wise, for saying nothing, who, I am very sure, if they should speak, would almost damn those ears, which, hearing them, would call their brothers fools. I'll tell thee more of this another time, but fish not with this melancholy bait, for this fool's gudgeon, this opinion. Gratiano's speech on the philosophy of love, and the effect of habit in taking off the force of passion, is as full of spirit and good sense. The graceful winding up of this play in the 5th act, after the tragic business is dispatched, is one of the happiest instances of Shakespeare's knowledge of the principles of the drama. We do not mean the pretended quarrel between Portia and Nerissa and their husbands about the rings, which is amusing enough, but the conversation just before and after the return of Portia to her own house, beginning, How sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank, and ending, Peace, how the moon sleeps with Endymion, and would not be awaked. There is a number of beautiful thoughts crowded into that short space, and linked together by the most natural transitions. When we first went to see Mr. Kean in Shylock, we expected to see, what we had been used to see, a decrepit old man, bent with age and ugly with mental deformity, grinning with deadly malice, with the venom of his heart congealed in the expression of his countenance, sullen, morose, gloomy, inflexible, brooding over one idea, that of his hatred, and fixed on one unalterable purpose, that of his revenge. We were disappointed, because we had taken our idea from other actors, not from the play. There is no proof there that Shylock is old, but a single line. Masonic and old Shylock both stand forth, which does not imply that he is infirm with age, and the circumstance that he has a daughter marriageable, which does not imply that he is old at all. It would be too much to say that his body should be made crooked and deformed to answer to his mind, which is bowed down and warped with prejudices and passion. That he has but one idea, it is not true. He has more ideas than any other person in the piece, and if he is intense and inveterate in the pursuit of his purpose, he shows the utmost elasticity, vigor, and presence of mind in the means of attaining it. But so rooted was our habitual impression of the part, from seeing it caricatured in the representation, that it was only from a careful perusal of the play itself that we saw our error. The stage is not in general the best place to study our author's characters in. It is too often filled with traditional commonplace conceptions of the part, handed down from sire to son, and suited to the taste of the great, vulgar, and the small. 'Tis an unweeded garden. Things rank and gross do merely gender in it. If a man of genius comes once in an age to clear away the rubbish, to make it fruitful and wholesome, they cry, "'Tis a bad school." It may be like nature, it may be like Shakespeare, but it is not like us. Admirable critics. End of The Merchant of Venice.
Chapter 25 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Winter's Tale. We wonder that Mr. Pope should have entertained doubts as to the genuineness of this play. He was, we suppose, shocked, as a certain critic suggests, at the chorus, Time, leaping over 16 years with his crutch between the third and fourth act, and at Antigonus's landing with the infant Perdita on the seacoast of Bohemia. These slips, or blemishes, however, do not prove it not to be Shakespeare's, for he was as likely to fall into them as anybody, but we do not know anybody but himself who could produce the beauties. The stuff of which the tragic passion is composed, the romantic sweetness, the comic humor, are evidently his. Even the crabbed and tortuous style of the speeches of Leontes, reasoning on his own jealousy, beset with doubts and fears, and entangled more and more in the thorny labyrinth, bears every mark of Shakespeare's peculiar manner of conveying the painful struggle of different thoughts and feelings, laboring for utterance, and almost strangled in the birth. For instance, "Have you not seen, Camillo? But that's past doubt. You have, for your eyeglass is thicker than a cuckold's horn. Or heard, for to a vision so apparent, rumour cannot be mute, or thought, for cogitation resides not within man that does not think. My wife is slippery. If thou wilt, confess, or else be impudently negative, to have nor eyes, nor ears, nor thought." Here Leontes is confounded with his passion, and does not know which way to turn himself to give words to the anguish, rage, and apprehension which tug at his breast. It is only as he is worked up into a clearer conviction of his wrongs by insisting on the grounds of his unjust suspicions to Camillo, who irritates him by his opposition, that he bursts out into the following vehement strain of bitter indignation. Yet even here his passion staggers, and is, as it were, oppressed with its own intensity. "Is whispering nothing? Is leaning cheek to cheek? Is meeting noses? Kissing with inside lip? Stopping the career of laughter with a sigh? A note infallible of breaking honesty? Horsing foot on foot? Skulking in corners? Wishing clocks more swift? Hours, minutes, the noon, midnight? and all eyes blind with the pin and web, but theirs only, that would unseen be wicked. Is this nothing? Why then the world and all that's in it is nothing. The covering sky is nothing, Bohemia is nothing, my wife is nothing. The character of Hermione is as much distinguished by its saint-like resignation and patient forbearance as that of Paulina is by her zealous and spirited remonstrances against the injustice done to the queen, and by her devoted attachment to her misfortunes. Hermione's restoration to her husband and her child, after her long separation from them, is as affecting in itself as it is striking in the representation. Camillo and the old shepherd and his son are subordinate, but not uninteresting instruments in the development of the plot. And though last, not least, comes Autolycus, a very pleasant, thriving rogue, and, what is the best feather in the cap of all knavery, he escapes with impunity in the end. The Winter's Tale is one of the best acting of our author's plays. We remember seeing it with great pleasure many years ago. It was on the night that King took leave of the stage, when he and Mrs. Jordan played together in the afterpiece of the wedding day. Nothing could go off with more éclat, with more spirit and grandeur of effect. Mrs. Siddons played Hermione, and in the last scene acted the painted statue to the life, with true monumental dignity and noble passion. Mr. Kemble, in Leontes, worked himself up into a very fine classical frenzy, and Bannister, as Autolycus, roared as loud for pity as a sturdy beggar could do, who felt none of the pain he counterfeited, and was sound of wind and limb. We shall never see these parts so acted again, or if we did, it would be in vain. Actors grow old, or no longer surprise us by their novelty. But true poetry, like nature, is always young, and we still read the courtship of Florizel and Perdita as we welcome the return of spring, with the same feelings as ever. Florizel, thou dearest Perdita, with these forced thoughts, I prithee, darken not the mirth of the feast, or I'll be thine, my fair, or not my father's, for I cannot be mine own, nor anything to any, if I be not thine. To this I am most constant, though destiny say no. Be merry, gentle, strangle such thoughts as these with anything that you behold the while. Your guests are coming. Lift up your countenance, as it were the day of celebration of that nuptial which we two have sworn will come. Perdita. O Lady Fortune, stand you auspicious. Enter shepherd, clown, mopsa, Daucus, servants, with Polixenes and Camillo disguised. Florizel. See your guests approach. Address yourself to entertain them sprightly, and let's be red with mirth. Shepherd. Fie, daughter! When my old wife lived, upon this day, she was both pantler, butler, cook, both dame and servant, welcomed all, served all, would sing her song and dance her turn, now here at the upper end of the table, now at the middle, on his shoulder and his, her face afire with labour, and the things she took to quench it she would to each one sip. You are retired, as if you were a feasted one, and not the hostess of the meeting. Pray you, bid these unknown friends to us welcome, for it is a way to make us better friends, more known. Come, quench your blushes, and present yourself that which you are, mistress of the feast. Come on, and bid us welcome to your sheep-shearing, as your good flock shall prosper. Perdita. Sir, welcome. To Polixenes and Camillo. It is my father's will I should take on me the hostessship of the day. You're welcome, sir. Give me those flowers there, Dorcas. Reverend sirs, for you there's rosemary and rue. These keep seeming and savour all the winter long. Grace and remembrance be unto you both, and welcome to our sharing. Polixenes. Shepherdess, a fair one are you. Well, you fit our ages with flowers of winter. Perdita. Sir, the year growing ancient, not yet on summer's death, nor on the birth of trembling winter. The fairest flowers of the season are our carnations, and streaked gillyflowers, which some call nature's bastards. Of that kind our rustic gardens barren, and I care not to get slips of them. Polixenes. Wherefore, gentle maiden, do you neglect them? Perdita. For I have heard it said there is an art which in their piedness shares with great creating nature. Polixenes. Say there be. Yet nature is made better by no mean, but nature makes that mean. So, or that art, which you say adds to nature, is an art that nature makes. You see, sweet maid, we marry a gentler scion to the wildest stock, and may conceive a bark of baser kind by bud of nobler race. This is an art which does mend nature, change it rather, but the art itself is nature. Perdita. So it is. Footnote. The lady, we see here, gives up the argument, but keeps her mind. Polixenes. They make your garden rich in gilly flowers, and do not call them bastards. Perdita. I'll not put the dibble in earth to set one slip of them. No more than, were I painted, I would wish this youth should say 'twere well, and only therefore desire to breed by me. Here's flowers for you. Hot lavender, mints, savory, marjoram, the marigold that goes to bed with the sun and with him rises weeping. These are flowers of middle summer, and I think they are given to men of middle age. You are very welcome. Camillo. I should leave grazing, were I of your flock, and only live by gazing. Perdita. Out, alas! You'd be so lean, the blasts of January would blow you through and through. Now, my fairest friends, I would I had some flowers of the spring that might become your time of day, and yours, that wear upon your virgin branches yet your maiden heads growing. O Proserpina! For the flowers now that frighted thou, let'st fall from Dis's wagon, daffodils, that come before the swallow dares, and take the winds of March with beauty, violets dim, but sweeter than the lids of Juno's eyes, or Cytherea's breath, pale primroses, that die unmarried ere they can behold bright Phoebus in his strength, a malady most incident to maids, bold oxlips, and the crown imperial, lilies of all kinds, the fleur-de-lis being one. Oh, these I lack to make you garlands of, and my sweet friend, to strow him o'er and o'er. Florizel. What, like a course? Perdita. No, like a bank, for love to lie and play on. Not like a course, or if not to be buried, but quick, and in mine arms. Come, take your flowers, methinks. I play as I have seen them do in wits and pastorals. Sure this robe of mine does change my disposition. Florizel. What you do still betters what is done. When you speak, sweet, I'd have you do it ever. When you sing, I'd have you buy and sell so give alms, pray so, and for the ordering your affairs, to sing them too. When you do dance, I wish you a wave of the sea, that you might ever do nothing but that, move still so, and own no other function. Each your doing, so singular in each particular, crowns what you're doing in the present deeds, that all your acts are queens. Perdita. O Torcles, your praises are too large, but that your youth and the true blood which peeps forth fairly through it, do plainly give you out an unstained shepherd. With wisdom, I might fear, my Doricles, you wooed me the false way. Florizel. I think you have as little skill to fear as I have purpose to put you to't. But come, our dance, I pray. Your hand, my Perdita, so turtles pair that never mean to part. Perdita. I'll swear for him. Polixenes. This is the prettiest low-born lass that ever ran on the greensward. Nothing she does or seems but smacks of something greater than herself, too noble for this place. Camillo. He tells her something that makes her blood look out. Good sooth, she is the queen of curds and cream. This delicious scene is interrupted by the father of the prince discovering himself to Florizel, and haughtily breaking off the intended match between his son and Perdita. When Polixenes goes out, Perdita says, Even here, undone, I was not much afraid, for once or twice I was about to speak, and tell him plainly the selfsame sun that shines upon his court hides not his visage from our cottage, but looks on to like. Will't please you, sir, be gone. To Florizel, I told you what would come of this. Beseech you, of your own state take care. This dream of mine, being now awake, I'll queen it no inch further, but milk my ewes and weep. as Perdita, the supposed shepherdess, turns out to be the daughter of Hermione and a princess in disguise. Both feelings of the pride of birth and the claims of nature are satisfied by the fortunate event of the story, and the fine romance of poetry is reconciled to the strictest court etiquette. End of The Winter's Tale. Chapter 26 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. All's Well That Ends Well. All's Well That Ends Well is one of the most pleasing of our author's comedies. The interest is, however, more of a serious than of a comic nature. The character of Helen is one of great sweetness and delicacy. She is placed in circumstances of the most critical kind, and has to court her husband both as a virgin and a wife. Yet the most scrupulous nicety of female modesty is not once violated. There is not one thought or action that ought to bring a blush into her cheeks, or that for a moment lessens her in our esteem. Perhaps the romantic attachment of a beautiful and virtuous girl to one placed above her hopes by the circumstances of birth and fortune was never so exquisitely expressed as in the reflections which she utters when young Roussillon leaves his mother's house, under whose protection she has been brought up with him, to repair to the French king's court. Helena, oh, that were all. I think not on my father, and these great tears grace his remembrance more than those I shed for him. What was he like? I have forgot him. My imagination carries no favour in it but Bertram's. I am undone. There is no living, none, if Bertram be away. It were all one that I should love a bright particular star, and think to wed it. He is so above me. In his bright radiance and collateral light must I be comforted, not in his sphere. The ambition in my love thus plagues itself. The hind that would be mated by the lion must die for love. 'Twas pretty, though a plague, to see him every hour, to sit and draw his arched brows, his hawking eye, his curls, in our heart's table, heart too capable of every line and trick of his sweet favour. But now he's gone, and my idolatrous fancy must sanctify his relics. The interest excited by this beautiful picture of a kind and innocent heart is kept up afterwards by her resolution to follow him to France, the success of her experiment in restoring the king's health, her demanding Bertram in marriage as recompense, his leaving her in disdain, her interview with him afterwards disguised as Diana, a young lady whom he importunes with his secret addresses, and their final reconciliation when the consequences of her stratagem and the proofs of her love are fully made known. The persevering gratitude of the French king to his benefactress, who cures him of a languishing distemper by a prescription hereditary in her family. The indulgent kindness of the countess, whose pride of birth yields, almost without struggle, to her affection for Helen. The honesty and uprightness of the good old Lord Lafeu makes very interesting parts of the picture. The wilful stubbornness and youthful petulance of Bertram are also very admirably described. The comic part of the play turns on the folly, boasting, and cowardice of Parolles, a parasite and hanger-on of Bertram's, the detection of whose false pretenses to bravery and honour forms a very amusing episode. He is first found out by the old Lord Lafeu, who says, "The soul of this man is in his clothes," and it is proved afterwards that his heart is in his tongue, and that both are false and hollow. The adventure of the bringing off of his drum has become proverbial as a satire on all ridiculous and blustering undertakings which the person never means to perform. Nor can anything be more severe than what one of the bystanders remarks upon what Parolles says of himself. Is it possible he should know what he is, and be that he is? Yet Parolles himself gives the best solution of the difficulty afterwards, when he is thankful to escape with his life and the loss of character. For, so that he can live on, he is by no means squeamish about the loss of pretensions, to which he had sense enough to know that he had no real claims, and which he had assumed only as a means to live. Parolles. Yet I am thankful. If my heart were great, 'twould burst at this. Captain I'll be no more, but I will eat and drink and sleep as soft as captain shall. Simply the thing I am shall make me live. Who knows himself a braggart, let him fear this, for it shall come to pass that every braggart shall be found an ass. Rust sword, cool blushes, and paroles live safest in shame. Being fooled, by foolery thrive. There's place and means for every man alive. I'll after them. The story of All's Well That Ends Well, and of several others of Shakespeare's plays, is taken from Boccaccio. The poet has dramatized the original novel with great skill and comic spirit, and has preserved all the beauty of character and sentiment without improving upon it, which was impossible. There is indeed in Boccaccio's serious pieces a truth, a pathos, and an exquisite refinement of sentiment, which is hardly to be met with in any other prose writer whatever. Justice has not been done him by the world. He has in general passed for a mere narrator of lascivious tales or idle jests. This character probably originated in his obnoxious attacks on the monks, and has been kept up by the grossness of mankind, who revenged their own want of refinement on Boccaccio, and only saw in his writings what suited the coarseness of their own tastes. But the truth is that he has carried sentiment of every kind to its very highest purity and perfection. By sentiment, we would here understand the habitual workings of some one powerful feeling, where the heart reposes almost entirely upon itself, without the violent excitement of opposing duties or untoward circumstances. In this way, nothing ever came up to the story of Federigo Alberigi and his falcon. The perseverance and attachment, the spirit of gallantry and generosity displayed in it, has no parallel in the history of heroical sacrifices. The feeling is so unconscious, too, and involuntary, is brought out in such small, unlooked-for, and unostentatious circumstances, as to show it to have been woven into the very nature and soul of the author. The story of Isabella is scarcely less fine, and is more affecting in the circumstances and the catastrophe. Dryden has done justice to the impassioned eloquence of the Tancred and Sigismunda, but has not given an adequate idea of the wild, preternatural interest of the story of Honoria. Cimon and Iphigenie is by no means one of the best, notwithstanding the popularity of the subject. The proof of unalterable affection given in the story of Geronimo, and the simple touches of nature and picturesque beauty in the story of the two holiday lovers who were poisoned by tasting of a leaf in the garden at Florence, are perfect masterpieces. The epithet of divine was well bestowed on this great painter of the human heart. The invention implied in his different tales is immense. But we are not to infer that it is all his own. He probably availed himself of all the common traditions which were floating in his time, and which he was the first to appropriate. Homer appears the most original of all authors, probably for no other reason than that we can trace the plagiarism no further. Boccaccio has furnished subjects to numberless writers since his time, both dramatic and narrative. The story of Griselda is borrowed from his Decameron by Chaucer, as is the Knight's Tale, Palamon and Arcite, from his poem of the Theseid. End of All's Well That Ends Well. Chapter 27 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Love's Labours Lost. If we were to part with any of the author's comedies, it should be this. Yet we should be loath to part with Don Adriano de Armado, that mighty potentate of nonsense, or his page, that handful of wit, with Nathaniel the curate, or Holofernes the schoolmaster, and their dispute after dinner on the golden cadences of poesy, with Costard the clown or Dol the constable. Biron is too accomplished a character to be lost to the world, and yet he could not appear without his fellow courtiers and the king. And if we were to leave out the ladies, the gentlemen would have no mistresses. So that we believe we may let the whole play stand as it is, and we shall hardly venture to, quote, set a mark of reprobation on it. Still, we have some objections to the style, which we think savours more of the pedantic spirit of Shakespeare's time than of his own genius, more of controversial divinity and the logic of Peter Lombard than of the inspiration of the Muse. It transports us quite as much to the manners of the court and the quirks of courts of law as to the scenes of nature or the fairyland of his own imagination. Shakespeare has set himself to imitate the tone of polite conversation, then prevailing among the fair, the witty, and the learned, and he has imitated it but too faithfully. It is as if the hand of Titian had been employed to give grace to the curls of a full-bottomed periwig, or Raphael had attempted to give expression to the tapestry figures in the House of Lords. Shakespeare has put an excellent description of this fashionable jargon into the mouth of the critical Holofernes as too picked, too spruce, too affected, too odd, as it were, too peregrinate, as I may call it. And nothing can be more marked than the difference when he breaks loose from the trammels he had imposed on himself, as light as bird from brake, and speaks in his own person. We think, for instance, that in the following soliloquy the poet has fairly got the start of Queen Elizabeth and her maids of honour. Baron. Oh, and I, forsooth, in love, I, that have been love's whip, a very beadle to an amorous sigh, a critic, nay, a night-watch constable, a domineering pedant o'er the boy, than whom no mortal more magnificent. This wimpled, whining, purblind, wayward boy, the Signor Junio, giant dwarf, Dan Cupid, regent of love rhymes, lord of folded arms, the anointed sovereign of sighs and groans, liege of all loiterers and malcontents, dread prince of plackets, king of codpieces, sole imperator and great general of trotting parators. Oh, my little heart. And I, to be a corporal of his field, and wear his colours like a tumbler's hoop. What I love, I sue, I seek a wife, a woman, that is like a German clock, still a-repairing, ever out of frame, and never going aright, being a watch, and being watched, that it may still go right. Nay, to be perjured, which is worst of all, and among three to love, the worst of all, a whitely wanton, with a velvet brow, with 2 pitch-balls stuck in her face for eyes. Ay, and by heaven, one that will do the deed, though Argus were her eunuch and her guard, and I to sigh for her, to watch for her, to pray for her. Go to! It is a plague that Cupid will impose for my neglect of his almighty dreadful little mite. Well, I will love, write, sigh, pray, sue, and groan. Some men must love my lady, and some Joan. The character of Biron, drawn by Rosaline, and that which Biron gives of Boyet, are equally happy. The observations on the use and abuse of study, and on the power of beauty to quicken the understanding as well as the senses, are excellent. The scene which has the greatest dramatic effect is that in which Biron, the king, Longueville, and Domain successively detect each other, and are detected in their breach of their vow and in their profession of attachment to their several mistresses, in which they suppose themselves to be overheard by no one. The reconciliation between these lovers and their sweethearts is also very good, and the penance which Rosaline imposes on Biron, before he can expect to gain her consent to marry him, full of propriety and beauty. Rosaline. Oft have I heard of you, my lord Baron, before I saw you, and the world's large tongue proclaims you for a man replete with mocks, full of comparisons and wounding flouts, which you on all estates will execute, that lie within the mercy of your wit, to weed this wormwood from your faithful brain, and therewithal to win me, if you please, without the which I am not to be won. You shall this 12-month term from day to day visit the speechless sick, and still converse with groaning wretches, and your task shall be, with all the fierce endeavour of your wit, to enforce the pained impotent to smile. Baron. To move wild laughter in the throat of death? It cannot be. It is impossible. Mirth cannot move a soul in agony. Rosaline. Why, that's the way to choke a gibing spirit, whose influence is begot of that loose grace, which shallow laughing hearers give to fools. A jest's prosperity lies in the ear of him that hears it, never in the tongue of him that makes it. Then, if sickly ears, deft with the clamours of their own dear groans, will hear your idle scorns, continue then, and I will have you, and that fault withal. But if they will not, throw away that spirit, and I shall find you empty of that fault, right joyful of your reformation. Baron, a 12-month. Well, befall what will befall, I'll jest a 12-month in an hospital. The famous cuckoo song closes the play, but we shall add no more criticisms. Quote, the words of Mercury are harsh after the songs of Apollo. End of Love's Labours Lost. Chapter 28 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Much Ado About Nothing. This admirable comedy used to be frequently acted till of late years. Mr. Garrick's Benedict was one of his most celebrated characters, and Mrs. Jordan, we have understood, played Beatrice very delightfully. The serious part is still the most prominent here, as in other instances that we have noticed. Hero is the principal figure in the piece, and leaves an indelible impression on the mind by her beauty, her tenderness, and the hard trial of her love. The passage in which Claudio first makes a confession of his affection towards her conveys as pleasing an image of the entrance of love into a youthful bosom as can well be imagined. Oh, my lord, when you went onward with this ended action, I looked upon her with a soldier's eye, that liked, but had a rougher task in hand than to drive liking in the name of love. But now I am returned, and that war thoughts have left their places vacant, in their rooms come thronging soft and delicate desires, all prompting me how fair young Hero is, saying, I liked her ere I went to wars. In the scene at the altar, when Claudio, urged on by the villain Don John, brings the charge of incontinence against her, and as it were divorces her in the very marriage ceremony, her appeals to her own conscious innocence and honour are made with the most affecting simplicity. Claudio, no, Leonato, I never tempted her with word too large, but as a brother to his sister showed bashful sincerity and comely love. Hero, and seemed I ever otherwise to you? Claudio, out on thy seeming, I will write against it. You seem to me as Dian in her orb, as chaste as the bud ere it is blown. But you are more intemperate in your blood than Valus, or those pampered animals that rage in savage sensuality. Hero, is my lord well, that he doth speak so wide? Leonato, are these things spoken, or do I but dream? John, sir, they are spoken, and these things are true. Benedict, this looks not like a nuptial. Hero, true. O God. The justification of Hero in the end, and her restoration to the confidence and arms of her lover, is brought about by one of those temporary consignments to the grave, of which Shakespeare seems to have been fond. He has perhaps explained the theory of this predilection in the following lines. Friar, she dying, as it must be so maintained, upon the instant that she was accused, shall be lamented, pitied, and excused of every hearer, for it so falls out that what we have we prize not to the worth while we enjoy it, but being lacked and lost, why then we rack the value, then we find the virtue that possession would not show us whilst it was ours. So it will fare with Claudio. When he shall hear she died upon his words, the idea of her love shall sweetly creep into his study of imagination, and every lovely organ of her life shall come apparelled in more precious habit, more moving, delicate, and full of life, into the eye and prospect of his soul, than when she lived indeed. The principal comic characters in Much Ado About Nothing, Benedick and Beatrice, are both essences in their kind. His character, as a woman-hater, is admirably supported, and his conversion to matrimony no less happily affected by the pretended story of Beatrice's love for him. It is hard to say which of the two scenes is the best, that of the trick, which is thus practised on Benedick, or that in which Beatrice is prevailed on to take pity on him by overhearing her cousin and her maid declare, which they do on purpose, that he is dying of love for her. There is something delightfully picturesque in the manner in which Beatrice, is described as coming to hear the plot which is contrived against herself. For look where Beatrice, like a lapwing, runs close by the ground to hear our conference. In consequence of what she hears, not a word of which is true, she exclaims when these good-natured informants are gone, "What fire is in mine ears? Can this be true? Stand I condemned for pride and scorn so much? Contempt, farewell, and maiden pride, adieu. No glory lives behind the back of such. And Benedick, love on, I will requite thee, taming my wild heart to thy loving hand. If thou dost love, my kindness shall incite thee to bind our loves up in an holy band. For others say thou dost deserve, and I believe it better than reportingly." And Benedick, on his part, is equally sincere in his repentance with equal reason, after he has heard the greybeard Leonato and his friend Monsieur Love discourse of the desperate state of his supposed inamorata. This can be no trick. The conference was sadly borne. They have the truth of this from Hero. They seem to pity the lady. It seems her affections have the full bent. Love me. Why, it must be requited. I hear how I am censured. They say I will bear myself proudly if I perceive the love come from her. They say, too, that she will rather die than give any sign of affection. I never did think to marry. I must not seem proud. Happy are they that hear their detractions and can put them to mending. They say the lady is fair. 'Tis a truth, I can bear them witness. And virtuous. 'Tis so, I cannot reprove it. And wise. But for loving me, by my troth it is no addition to her wit. Nor no great argument of her folly, for I will be horribly in love with her. I may chance to have some odd quirks and remnants of wit broken on me, because I have railed so long against marriage. But doth not the appetite alter? A man loves the meat in his youth that he cannot endure in his age. Shall quips and sentences and these paper bullets of the brain awe a man from the career of his humour? No, the world must be peopled. When I said I would die a bachelor, I did not think I should live till I were married. Here comes Beatrice. By this day she's a fair lady. I do spy some marks of love in her. The beauty of all this arises from the characters of the persons so entrapped. Benedick is a professed and staunch enemy to marriage, and gives very plausible reasons for the faith that is in him. And as to Beatrice, she persecutes him all day with her jests, so that he could hardly think of being troubled with them at night. She not only turns him, but all other things into jest, and is proof against everything serious. Hero. Disdain and scorn ride sparkling in her eyes, misprizing what they look on, and her wit values itself so highly that to her all matter else seems weak. She cannot love, nor take no shape nor project of affection. She is so self-endeared. Ursula. Sure, I think so. And therefore certainly it were not good she knew his love, lest she make sport at it. Hero. Why, you speak truth. I never yet saw man how wise, how noble, young, how rarely featured, but she would spell him backward. If fair-faced, she'd swear the gentleman should be her sister. If black, why, nature drawing of an antic made a foul blot. If tall, a lance ill-headed. If low, an agate very vilely cut. If speaking, why, a vein blown with all winds. If silent, why, a block moved with none. So turns she every man the wrong side out, and never gives to truth and virtue that which simpleness and merit purchaseth. These were happy materials for Shakespeare to work on, and he has made a happy use of them. Perhaps that middle point of comedy was never more nicely hit, in which the ludicrous blends with the tender, and our follies, turning round against themselves in support of our affections, retain nothing but their humanity. Dogberry and Verges in this play are inimitable specimens of quaint blundering and misprisions of meaning, and are a standing record of that formal gravity of pretension and total want of common understanding, which Shakespeare no doubt copied from real life, and which in the course of 200 years appear to have ascended from the lowest to the highest offices in the state. End of Much Ado About Nothing. Chapter 29 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As You Like It. Shakespeare has here converted the forest of Arden into another Arcadia, where they, quote, fleet the time carelessly, as they did in the golden world. It is the most ideal of any of this author's plays. It is a pastoral drama in which the interest arises more out of the sentiments and characters than out of the actions or situations. It is not what is done, but what is said, that claims our attention. Nursed in solitude, quote, under the shade of melancholy boughs, the imagination grows soft and delicate, and the wit runs riot in idleness, like a spoiled child that is never sent to school. Caprice and fancy reign and revel here, and stern necessity is banished to the court. The mild sentiments of humanity are strengthened with thought and leisure. The echo of the cares and noise of the world strikes upon the ear of those, quote, who have felt them knowingly, softened by time and distance. Quote, they hear the tumult and are still. The very air of the place seems to breathe a spirit of philosophical poetry, to stir the thoughts, to touch the heart with pity, as the drowsy forest rustles to the sighing gale. Never was there such beautiful moralizing, equally free from pedantry or petulance. And this their life, exempt from public haunts, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. Jacques is the only purely contemplative character in Shakespeare. He thinks and does nothing. His whole occupation is to amuse his mind, and he is totally regardless of his body and his fortunes. He is the prince of philosophical idlers. His only passion is thought. He sets no value upon anything but as it serves as food for reflection. He can suck melancholy out of a song as a weasel sucks eggs. The motley fool who morals on the time is the greatest prize he meets with in the forest. He resents Orlando's passion for Rosalind as some disparagement of his own passion for abstract truth, and leaves the Duke, as soon as he is restored to his sovereignty, to seek his brother out who has quitted it and turned hermit. Out of these convertites there is much matter to be heard and learnt. Within the sequestered and romantic glades of the forest of Arden, they find leisure to be good and wise, or to play the fool and fall in love. Rosalind's character is made up of sportive gaiety and natural tenderness. Her tongue runs the faster to conceal the pressure at her heart. She talks herself out of breath, only to get deeper in love. The coquetry with which she plays with her lover and the double character which she has to support is managed with the nicest address. How full of voluble, laughing grace is all her conversation with Orlando. In heedless mazes running, with wanton haste and giddy cunning. How full of real fondness and pretended cruelty is her answer to him when he promises to love her, quote, forever and a day. Say a day without the ever. No, no, Orlando. Men are April when they woo, December when they wed. Maids are May when they are maids. But the sky changes when they are wives. I will be more jealous of thee than a Barbary cock-pigeon over his hen, more clamorous than a parrot against rain, more newfangled than an ape, more giddy in my desires than a monkey. I will weep for nothing, like Diana in the fountain, and I will do that when you are disposed to be merry. I will laugh like a hyene, and that when you are inclined to sleep. Orlando. But will my Rosalind do so? Rosalind. By my life, she will do as I do. The silent and retired character of Celia is a necessary relief to the provoking loquacity of Rosalind, nor can anything be better conceived or more beautifully described than the mutual affection between the two cousins. We still have slept together, rose at an instant, learned, played, eat together, and wheresoe'er we went, like Juno's swans, still we went coupled and inseparable. The unrequited love of Silvius for Phoebe shows the perversity of this passion in the commonest scenes of life, and the rubs and stops which nature throws in its way, where fortune has placed none. Touchstone is not in love, but he will have a mistress as a subject for the exercise of his grotesque humour, and to show his contempt for the passion by his indifference about the person. He is a rare fellow. He is a mixture of the ancient cynic philosopher with the modern buffoon, and turns folly into wit, and wit into folly, just as the fit takes him. His courtship of Audrey not only throws a degree of ridicule on the state of wedlock itself, but he is equally an enemy to the prejudices of opinion in other respects. The lofty tone of enthusiasm which the Duke and his companions in exile spread over the stillness and solitude of a country life receives a pleasant shock from Touchstone's sceptical determination of the question. Corin, and how like you this shepherd's life, Mr. Touchstone? Clown. Truly, shepherd, in respect of itself, it is a good life. But in respect that it is a shepherd's life, it is not. In respect that it is solitary, I like it very well. But in respect that it is private, it is a very vile life. Now in respect it is in the fields, it pleaseth me well. But in respect it is not in the court, it is tedious. As it is a spare life, look you, it fits my humour. But as there is no more plenty in it, it goes much against my stomach. Ximenen's celebrated work on solitude discovers only half the sense of this passage. There is hardly any of Shakespeare's plays that contain a greater number of passages that have been quoted in books of extracts, or a greater number of phrases that have become, in a manner, proverbial. If we were to give all the striking passages, we should give half the play. We will only recall a few of the most delightful to the reader's recollection. Such are the meeting between Orlando and Adam, the exquisite appeal of Orlando to the humanity of the Duke and his company to supply him with food for the old man, and their answer, the Duke's description of a country life, and the account of Jacques moralizing on the wounded deer, his meeting with Touchstone in the forest, his apology for his own melancholy and his satirical vein, and the well-known speech on the stages of human life, the old song of "Blow, blow, thou winter's wind." Rosalind's description of the marks of a lover, and of the progress of time with different persons, the picture of the snake wreathed round Oliver's neck, while the lioness watches her sleeping prey, and Touchstone's lecture to the shepherd, his defence of cuckolds, and panegyric on the virtues of an if. All of these are familiar to the reader. There is one passage of equal delicacy and beauty which may have escaped him, and with it we shall close our account of As You Like It. It is Phoebe's description of Ganymede at the end of the third act. Think not I love him, though I ask for him. 'Tis but a peevish boy. Yet he talks well. But what care I for words? Yet words do well, when he that speaks them pleases those that hear. It is a pretty youth, not very pretty, but sure he's proud, and yet his pride becomes him. He'll make a proper man. The best thing in him is his complexion, and faster than his tongue did make offence, his eye did heal it up. He is not very tall, yet for his years he's tall. His leg is but so, and yet 'tis well. There was a pretty redness in his lip, a little riper and more lusty red than that mixed in his cheek, 'twas just the difference betwixt the constant red and mingled damask. There be some women, Silvius, had they marked him in parcels as I did, would have gone near to fall in love with him. But for my part, I love him not, nor hate him not. And yet I have more cause to hate him than to love him. For what had he to do to chide at me? End of As You Like It. Chapter 30 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Taming of the Shrew. The Taming of the Shrew is almost the only one of Shakespeare's comedies that has a regular plot and downright moral. It is full of bustle, animation, and rapidity of action. It shows admirably how self-will is only to be got the better of by stronger will, and how one degree of ridiculous perversity is only to be driven out by another still greater. Petruchio is a madman in his senses, a very honest fellow, who hardly speaks a word of truth, and succeeds in all his tricks and impostures. He acts his assumed character to the life, with a most fantastical extravagance, with complete presence of mind, with untired animal spirits, and without a particle of ill humour from beginning to end. The situation of poor Catherine, worn out by his incessant persecutions, becomes at last almost as pitiable as it is ludicrous, and it is difficult to say which to admire most, the unaccountableness of his actions or the unalterableness of his resolutions. It is a character which most husbands ought to study, unless, perhaps, the very audacity of Petruchio's attempt might alarm them more than his success would encourage them. What a sound must the following speech carry to some married ears!
Think you a little din can daunt my ears? Have I not in my time heard lions roar? Have I not heard the sea, puffed up with winds, rage like an angry boar, chafed with sweat? Have I not heard great ordnance in the field, and heaven's artillery thunder in the skies? Have I not in a pitched battle heard loud larums, neighing steeds, and trumpets clang? And do you tell me of a woman's tongue that gives not half so great a blow to hear as will a chestnut in a farmer's fire?
Not all Petruchio's rhetoric would persuade more than, quote, some dozen followers to be of this heretical way of thinking. He unfolds his scheme for the taming of the shrew on a principle of contradiction thus:
I'll woo her with some spirit when she comes. Say that she rail, why then I'll tell her plain she sings as sweetly as a nightingale. Say that she frown, I'll say she looks as clear as morning roses newly washed with dew. Say she be mute, and will not speak a word, then I'll commend her volubility, and say she uttereth piercing eloquence. If she do bid me pack, I'll give her thanks, as though she bid me stay by her a week. If she deny to wed, I'll crave the day when I shall ask the banns, and when be married.
He accordingly gains her consent to the match by telling her father that he has got it, disappoints her by not returning at the time he has promised to wed her, and when he returns, creates no small consternation by the oddity of his dress and equipage. This, however, is nothing to the astonishment excited by his mad-brained behavior at the marriage. Here is the account of it by an eyewitness.
Gremio. Tut, she's a lamb, a dove, a fool to him. I'll tell you, Sir Lucentio, when the priest should ask if Caterina should be his wife, ay, by Gog's wounds, quoth he, and swore so loud, that, all amazed, the priest let fall the book, and as he stooped again to take it up, this mad-brained bridegroom took him such a cuff, that down fell priest and book and priest. Now take them up, quoth he, if any list.
Tronio. What said the wench when he rose up again?
Gremio trembled and shook, for why he stamped and swore as if the vicar meant to cozen him. But after many ceremonies done, he calls for wine. A health, quoth he, as if he'd been abroad carousing with his mates after a storm, quaffed off the muscadel, and threw the sops all in the sexton's face, having no other cause but that his beard grew thin and hungerly, and seemed to ask his sops as he was drinking. This done, he took the bride about the neck, and kissed her lips with such a clamorous smack, that at their parting all the church echoed, and I seeing this came thence for very shame, and after me, I know, the rout is coming. Such a mad marriage never was before.
The most striking and at the same time laughable feature in the character of Petruchio throughout is the studied approximation to the intractable character of real madness, his apparent insensibility to all external considerations, and utter indifference to everything but the wild and extravagant freaks of his own self-will. There is no contending with a person on whom nothing makes any impression but his own purposes, and who is bent on his own whims just in proportion as they seem to want common sense. With him, a thing's being plain and reasonable is a reason against it. The airs he gives himself are infinite, and his caprices as sudden as they are groundless. The whole of his treatment of his wife at home is in the same spirit of ironical attention and inverted gallantry. Everything flies before his will, like a conjurer's wand, and he only metamorphoses his wife's temper by metamorphosing her senses and all the objects she sees at a word's speaking. Such are his insisting that it is the moon and not the sun which they see, etc. This extravagance reaches its most pleasant and poetical height in the scene where, on their return to her father's, they meet old Vincentio, whom Petruchio immediately addresses as a young lady.
Petruchio. Good morrow, gentle mistress. Where away? Tell me, sweet Kate, and tell me truly too, hast thou beheld a fresher gentlewoman? Such war white and red within her cheeks! What stars do spangle heaven with such beauty? As those two eyes become that heavenly face? Fair, lovely maid, once more good day to thee. Sweet Kate, embrace her for beauty's sake.
Hortensio. He'll make the man mad to make a woman of him. Catherine. Young, budding virgin, fair and fresh and sweet, whither away, or where is thy abode? Happy the parents of so fair a child. Happier the man whose favourable stars allot thee for his lovely bedfellow.
Petruchio. Why, how now, Kate? I hope thou art not mad. This is a man, old, wrinkled, faded, withered, not a maiden, as thou sayest he is.
Catherine. Pardon, old father, my mistaken eyes. I have been so bedazed with the sun, that everything I look on seemeth green. Now I perceive thou art a reverend father. The whole is carried on with equal spirit, as if the poet's comic muse had wings of fire. It is strange how one man could be so many things, but so it is. The concluding scene, in which trial is made of the obedience of the new married wives, so triumphantly for Petruchio, is a very happy one. In some parts of this play there is a little too much about music masters and masters of philosophy. They were things of greater rarity in those days than they are now. Nothing, however, can be better than the advice which Tranio gives his master for the prosecution of his studies. The mathematics and the metaphysics fall to them as you find your stomach serves you. No profit grows where is no pleasure ta'en. In brief, sir, study what you most affect. We have heard the honeymoon called, quote, an elegant Catherine and Petruchio. We suspect we do not understand this word elegant in the sense that many people do. But in our sense of the word, we should call Lucentio's description of his mistress elegant.
Tranio, I saw her coral lips to move, and with her breath she did perfume the air. Sacred and sweet was all I saw in her.
When Biondello tells the same Lucentio for his encouragement, I know a wench married in an afternoon, as she went to the garden for parsley to stuff a rabbit, and so may you, sir. There's nothing elegant in this, and yet we hardly know which of the two passages is the best. The Taming of the Shrew is a play within a play. It is supposed to be a play acted for the benefit of Sly the tinker, who is made to believe himself a lord when he wakes after a drunken brawl. The character of Sly and the remarks with which he accompanies the play are as good as the play itself. His answer when he is asked how he likes it, indifferent well, 'tis a good piece of work, would 'twere done, is in good keeping, as if he were thinking of his Saturday night's job. Sly does not change his taste with this new situation, but in the midst of splendor and luxury still calls out lustily and repeatedly for a pot of the smallest ale. He is very slow in giving up his personal identity in his sudden advancement. I am Christopher Sly. Call me not honour nor lordship. I never drank sack in my life, and if you give me any conserves, give me conserves of beef. Never ask me what raiment I'll wear, for I have no more doublets than packs, no more stockings than legs, no more shoes than feet. Nay, sometimes more feet than shoes, or such shoes as my toes look through the over-leather. What, would you make me mad? Am I not Christopher Sly, old Sly's son of Burton Heath? By birth a pedlar, by education a card-maker, by transmutation a bear-herd, and now by present profession a tinker? Pugh! Ask Marian Hackett, the fat alewife of Wincot, if she know me not. If she say I am not 14 pence on score for sheer ale, score me up for the lyingest knave in Christendom. This is honest. The Slys are no rogues, as he says of himself. We have a great predilection for this representative of the family, and what makes us like him the better is that we take him to be of kin, not many degrees removed, to Sancho Panza. End of Taming of the Shrew. Chapter 31 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Measure for Measure. This is a play as full of genius as it is of wisdom. Yet there is an original sin in the nature of the subject, which prevents us from taking a cordial interest in it. The height of moral argument which the author has maintained in the intervals of passion, or blended with the more powerful impulses of nature, is hardly surpassed in any of his plays. But there is in general a want of passion. The affections are at a stand. Our sympathies are repulsed and defeated in all directions. The only passion which influences the story is that of Angelo, and yet he seems to have a much greater passion for hypocrisy than for his mistress. Neither are we greatly enamoured of Isabella's rigid chastity, though she could not act otherwise than she did. We do not feel the same confidence in the virtue that is sublimely good at another's expense, as if it had been out to some less disinterested trial. As to the Duke, who makes a very imposing and mysterious stage character, he is more absorbed in his own plots and gravity than anxious for the welfare of the state, more tenacious of his own character than attentive to the feelings and apprehensions of others. Claudio is the only person who feels naturally, and yet he is placed in circumstances of distress which almost preclude the wish for his deliverance. Mariana is also in love with Angelo, whom we hate. In this respect, there may be said to be a general system of cross-purposes between the feelings of the different characters and the sympathy of the reader or the audience. This principle of repugnance seems to have reached its height in the character of Master Barnardine, who not only sets at defiance the opinions of others, but has even thrown off all self-regard. One that apprehends death no more dreadfully but as a drunken sleep, careless, reckless, and fearless of what's past, present, and to come. Unquote. He is a fine antithesis to the morality and hypocrisy of the other characters of the play. Barnardine is Caliban, transported from Prospero's wizard island to the forests of Bohemia, or the prisons of Vienna. He is the creature of bad habits, as Caliban is of gross instincts. He has, however, a strong notion of the natural fitness of things according to his own sensations. He has been drinking hard all night, and he will not be hanged that day. Unquote. And Shakespeare has let him off at last. We do not understand why the philosophical German critic Schlegel should be so severe on these pleasant persons, Lucio, Pompey, and Master Froth, as to call them wretches. They appear almighty comfortable in their occupations, and determined to pursue them, as the flesh and fortune should serve. A very good exposure of the want of self-knowledge and contempt for others, which is so common in the world, is put into the mouth of Abhorsen, the jailer, when the provost proposes to associate Pompey with him in his office. "Abad, sir, fie upon him, he will discredit our mystery." Unquote. And the same answer would serve in 9 instances out of 10 to the same kind of a remark. "Go to, sir, you weigh equally, a feather will turn the scale." Shakespeare was in one sense the least moral of all writers, for morality, commonly so called, is made up of antipathies, and his talent consisted of sympathy with human nature, in all its shapes, degrees, depressions, and elevations. The object of the pedantic moralist is to find out the bad in everything. His was to show that there is some soul of goodness in things evil. Even Master Barnardine is not left to the mercy of what others think of him, but when he comes in, speaks for himself, and pleads his own cause, as well as if counsel had been assigned him. In one sense, Shakespeare was no moralist at all. In another, he was the greatest of all moralists. He was a moralist in the same sense in which nature is one. He taught what he had learnt from her. He showed the greatest knowledge of humanity with the greatest fellow feeling for it. One of the most dramatic passages in the present play is the interview between Claudio and his sister, when she comes to inform him of the conditions on which Angelo will spare his life. Claudio.
Let me know the point.
Isabella. Oh, I do fear thee, Claudio, and I quake, lest thou a feverous life shouldst entertain, and 6 or 7 winters more respect than a perpetual honour. Darest thou die? The sense of death is most in apprehension, and the poor beetle that we tread upon in corporal sufferance finds a pang as great as when a giant dies.
Why give you me this shame? Think you I can a resolution fetch from flowery tenderness? If I must die, I will encounter darkness as a bride, and hug it in mine arms.
There spake my brother. There my father's grave did utter forth a voice. Yes, thou must die. Thou art too noble to conserve a life in base appliances. This outward sainted deputy, whose settled visage and deliberate word nips youth in the head, and follies doth immew as falcon doth a fowl, is yet a devil.
The princely Angelo?
Oh, 'tis the cunning livery of hell, the damnedest body to invest in cover and princely guards. Dost thou think, Claudio, if I would yield him my virginity, thou mightst be freed?
Oh, heavens! It cannot be!
Yes, he would give thee for this rank offence, so to offend him still. This night's the time that I should do what I abhor to name, or else thou diest tomorrow.
Thou shalt not do it.
Oh, were it but my life, I'd throw it down for your deliverance as frankly as a pin.
Thanks, dear Isabel.
Be ready, Claudio, for your death tomorrow.
Yes. Has he affections in him that thus can make him bite the law by the nose, when he would force it sure it is no sin, or of the deadly 7 it is the least?
Which is the least?
If it were damnable, he being so wise, why would he for the momentary trick be purgably fined? Oh, Isabel!
What says my brother?
Death is a fearful thing.
And shamed life a hateful.
Ay, but to die, and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot, this sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling regions of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds, blown with restless violence round about the pendant world, or to be worse than worst of those that lawless and uncertain thoughts imagine howling. 'Tis too horrible. The weariest and most loathed worldly life that age, ache, penury, and imprisonment can lay on nature is a paradise to what we fear of death.
Alas, alas.
Sweet sister, let me live. What sin you do to save a brother's life, nature dispenses with a deed so far that it becomes a virtue.
What adds to the dramatic beauty of this scene and the effect of Claudio's passionate attachment to life is that it immediately follows the Duke's lecture to him on the character of the friar, recommending an absolute indifference to it. Reason thus with life. If I do lose thee, I do lose a thing that none but fools would keep. A breath thou art, servile to all the skyey influences that do this habitation, where thou keep'st, hourly afflict. Merely thou art death's fool. For him thou labourest by thy flight to shun, and yet runs toward him still. Thou art not noble, for all the accommodations that thou bear'st are nursed by baseness. Thou art by no means valiant, for thou dost fear the soft and tender fork of a poor worm. Thy best of rest is sleep, and that thou oft provokest, yet grossly fear'st thy death, which is no more. Thou art not thyself, for thou exist'st on many 1,000 grains that issue out of dust. Happy thou art not, for what thou hast not, still thou strivest to get, and what thou hast forgett'st. Thou art not certain, for thy complexion shifts to strange effects after the moon. If thou art rich, thou art poor, for like an ass whose back with ingots bows, thou bear'st thy heavy riches but a journey, and death unloads thee. Friend thou hast none, for thy own bowels, which do call thee sire, the mere effusion of thy proper loins do curse the gout, serpigo, and the rheum, for ending thee no sooner. Thou hast nor youth nor age, but as it were an after-dinner's sleep, dreaming on both. For all thy blessed youth becomes as aged, and doth beg the alms of palsied eld. And when thou art old and rich, thou hast neither heat, affection, limb, nor beauty to make thy riches pleasant. What's yet in this that bears the name of life? Yet in this life lie hid more thousand deaths. Yet death we fear, that makes these odds all even. End of Measure for Measure. Chapter 32 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Merry Wives of Windsor. The Merry Wives of Windsor is no doubt a very amusing play, with a great deal of humour, character, and nature in it, but we should have liked it much better if anyone else had been the hero of it instead of Falstaff. We could have been contented if Shakespeare had not been commanded to show the knight in love. Wits and philosophers, for the most part, do not shine in that character, and Sir John himself by no means comes off with flying colours. Many people complain of the degradation and insults to which Don Quixote is so frequently exposed in his various adventures. But what are the unconscious indignities which he suffers, compared with the sensible mortifications which Falstaff is made to bring upon himself? What are the blows and buffetings which the Don receives from the staves of the Yangeesian carriers, or from Sancho Panza's more hard-hearted hands, compared with the contamination of the buck-basket, the disguise of the fat woman of Brentford, and the horns of Herne the Hunter, which are discovered on Sir John's head? In reading the play, we indeed wish him well through all these discomfitures, but it would have been as well as if he had not got into them. Falstaff in The Merry Wives of Windsor is not the man he was in the two parts of Henry IV. His wit and eloquence have left him. Instead of making a butt of others, he is made a butt of by them. Neither is there a single particle of love in him to excuse his follies. He is merely a designing, barefaced knave, and an unsuccessful one. The scene with Ford is Master Brooke, and that with Simple, Slender's man, who comes to ask after the wise woman, are almost the only ones in which his old intellectual ascendancy appears. He is like a person recalled to the stage to perform an unaccustomed and ungracious part, and in which we perceive only some faint sparks of those flashes of merriment that were wont to send the hearers in a roar. But the single scene with Doll Tearsheet, or Mrs. Quickly's account of his desiring, quote, to eat some of housewife Keech's prawns, and telling her, quote, to be no more so familiarity with such people, is worth the whole of the Merry Wives of Windsor put together. Ford's jealousy, which is the mainspring of the comic incidents, is certainly very well managed. Page, on the contrary, appears to be somewhat uxorious in his disposition, and we have pretty plain indications of the effect of the characters of the husbands on the different degrees of fidelity in their wives. Mrs. Quickly makes a very lively go-between, both between Falstaff and his Dulcineas, and Anne Page and her lovers, and seems in the latter case so intent on her own interest as totally to overlook the intentions of her employers. Her master, Dr. Caius, the Frenchman, and her fellow-servant Jack Rugby are very completely described. This last-mentioned person is rather quaintly commended by Mrs. Quickly as, quote, an honest, willing, kind fellow, as ever servant shall come in house withal, and I warrant you no tell-tale, nor no breed bait. His worst fault is, that he is given to prayer. He is something peevish in that way, but nobody but has his fault. The Welsh parson, Sir Hugh Evans, a title which in those days was given to the clergy, is an excellent character in all respects. He is as respectable as he is laughable. He has, quote, very good discretions and very odd humours. The duel scene with Caius gives him an opportunity to show his chollers and his tremblings of mind, his valor and his melancholy, in an irresistible manner. In the dialogue, which at his mother's request he holds with his pupil, William Page, to show his progress in learning, it is hard to say whether the simplicity of the master or the scholar is the greatest. Nym, Bardolph, and Pistol are but the shadows of what they were, and just as Shallow himself has little of his consequence left. But his cousin, Slender, makes up for the deficiency. He is a very potent piece of imbecility. In him the pretensions of the worthy Gloucestershire family are well kept up and immortalized. He and his friend Sackerson, and his book of songs, and his love of Anne Page, and his having nothing to say to her, can never be forgotten. It is the only first-rate character in the play, but it is in that class. Shakespeare is the only writer who was as great at describing weakness as strength. End of The Merry Wives of Windsor. Chapter 33 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Comedy of Errors. This comedy is taken very much from the Menechmi of Plautus, and is not an improvement on it. Shakespeare appears to have bestowed no great pains on it, and there are but a few passages which bear the decided stamp of his genius. He seems to have relied on his author, and on the interest arising out of the intricacy of the plot. The curiosity excited is certainly very considerable, though not of the most pleasing kind. We are teased as with a riddle, which notwithstanding we try to solve. In reading the play, from the sameness of the names of the two Antipholus and the two Dromios, as well as from their being constantly taken for each other by those who see them, it is difficult, without a painful effort of attention, to keep the characters distinct in the mind. And again, on the stage, either the complete similarity of their persons and dress must produce the same perplexity whenever they first enter, or the identity of appearance which the story supposes will be destroyed. We still, however, having a clue to the difficulty, can tell which is which, merely from the practical contradictions which arise as soon as the different parties begin to speak, and we are indemnified for the perplexity and blunders into which we are thrown by seeing others thrown into greater and almost inextricable ones. This play, among other considerations, leads us not to feel much regret that Shakespeare was not what is called a classical scholar. We do not think his forte would have ever lain in imitating or improving on what others invented, so much as inventing for himself and perfecting what he invented, not perhaps by the omission of faults, but by the addition of the highest excellences. His own genius was strong enough to bear him up, and he soared longest and best on unborrowed plumes. The only passage of a very Shakespearean cast in this comedy is the one in which the abbess, with admirable characteristic artifice, makes Adriana confess her own misconduct in driving her husband mad. Abbess. How long hath this possession held the man? Adriana. This week he hath been heavy, sour, sad, and much different from the man he was. But till this afternoon his passion ne'er brake into extremity of rage. Abbess. Hath he not lost much wealth at wreck by sea? Buried some dear friend? Hath not else his eye strayed his affection in an unlawful love? A sin prevailing much in youthful men, who give their eyes the liberty of gazing. Which of these sorrows is he subject to? To none of these, except it be the last, namely some love that drew him oft from home. You should for that have reprehended him. Why, so I did, but not rough enough. As roughly as my modesty would let me. Haply, in private. And in assemblies too. Ay, but not enough. It was the copy of our conference. In bed he slept not for my urging it. At board he fed not for my urging it. Alone it was the subject of my theme. In company I often glanced at it. Still did I tell him it was vile and bad. Abbess. And therefore came it that the man was mad. The venomed clamours of a jealous woman poison more deadly than a mad dog's tooth. It seems his sleeps were hindered by thy railing, and therefore comes it that his head is light. Thou sayest his meat was sauced with thy upbraidings. Unquiet meals make ill digestions, therefore the raging fire of fever bred. And what's a fever but a fit of madness? Thou say'st his sports were hindered by thy brawls, sweet recreation barred. What doth ensue but moody and dull melancholy, kinsman to grim and comfortless despair? And at her heels a huge infectious troop of pale distemperatures and foes to life. In food, in sport, and life-preserving rest, to be disturbed, would mad or man or beast. The consequences then by jealous fits have scared thy husband from the use of wits. Luciana. She never reprehended him but mildly, when he demeaned himself rough, rude, and wildly. Why bear you these rebukes and answer not? Adriana. She did betray me to my own reproof. Pinch the conjurer is also an excrescence not to be found in Plautus. He is indeed a very formidable anachronism. They brought one Pinch, a hungry, lean-faced villain, a mere anatomy, a mountebank, a threadbare juggler, and a fortune-teller, a needy, hollow-eyed, sharp-looking wretch, a living dead man. This is exactly like some of the puritanical portraits to be met with in Hogarth. End of the Comedy of Errors. Chapter 34 of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Doubtful Plays of Shakespeare. We shall give, for the satisfaction of the reader, what the celebrated German critic Schlegel says on this subject, and then add a very few remarks of our own. Quote, all the editors, with the exception of Capel, are unanimous in rejecting Titus Andronicus as unworthy of Shakespeare, though they always allow it to be printed with other pieces, as the scapegoat, as it were, of their abusive criticism. The correct method in such an investigation is first to examine into the external grounds, evidences, etc., and to weigh their worth, and then to adduce the internal reasons derived from the quality of the work. The critics of Shakespeare follow a course directly the reverse of this. They set out with a preconceived opinion against a piece, and seek, in justification of this opinion, to render the historical grounds suspicious and to set them aside. Titus Andronicus is to be found in the first folio edition of Shakespeare's works, which it was known was conducted by Hemminge and Condell, for many years his friends and fellow managers of the same theatre. Is it possible to persuade ourselves that they would not have known if a piece in their repertory did or did not actually belong to Shakespeare? And are we to lay to the charge of these honourable men a designed fraud in this single case, when we know that they did not show themselves so very desirous of scraping everything together which went by the name of Shakespeare, but, as it appears, merely gave those plays of which they had manuscripts in hand? Yet the following circumstance is still stronger. George Mears, a contemporary and admirer of Shakespeare, mentions Titus Andronicus in an enumeration of his works in the year 1598. Mears was personally acquainted with the poet, and so very intimately that the latter read over to him his sonnets before they were printed. I cannot conceive that all the critical skepticism in the world would be sufficient to get over such a testimony. This tragedy, it is true, is framed according to a false idea of the tragic, which by an accumulation of cruelties and enormities degenerates into the horrible, and yet leaves no deep impression behind. The story of Tereus and Philomela is heightened and overcharged under other names, and mixed up with the repast of Atreus and Thyestes, and many other incidents. In detail, there is no want of beautiful lines, bold images, nay, even features which betray the peculiar conception of Shakespeare. Among these we may reckon the joy of the treacherous Moor at the blackness and ugliness of his child begotten adultery, and in the compassion of Titus Andronicus, grown childish through grief, for a fly which had been struck dead, and his rage afterwards, when he imagines he discovers in it his black enemy. We recognize the future poet of Lear. Are critics afraid that Shakespeare's fame would be injured were it established that in his early youth he ushered into the world a feeble and immature work? Was Rome the less the conqueror of the world because Remus could leap over its first walls? Let anyone place himself in Shakespeare's situation at the commencement of his career. He found only a few indifferent models, and yet these met with the most favourable reception, because men are never difficult to please in the novelty of an art before their taste has become fastidious from choice and abundance. Must not this situation have had its influence on him before he learned to make higher demands on himself, and by digging deeper in his own mind, discovered the richest veins of a noble metal? It is even highly probable that he must have made several failures before getting into the right path. Genius is in a certain sense infallible, and has nothing to learn, but art is to be learned, and must be acquired by practice and experience. In Shakespeare's acknowledged works we find hardly any traces of his apprenticeship, and yet an apprenticeship he certainly had. This every artist must have, and especially in a period where he has not before him the example of a school already formed. I consider it as extremely probable that Shakespeare began to write for the theatre at a much earlier period than the one which is generally stated, namely, not till after the year 1590. It appears that as early as the year 1584, when only 20 years of age, he had left his paternal home and repaired to London. Can we imagine that such an active head would remain idle for 6 whole years without making any attempt to emerge by his talents from an uncongenial situation? That in the dedication of the poem of Venus and Adonis he calls it, quote, the first heir of his invention, proves nothing against the supposition. It was the first which he printed. He might have composed it at an earlier period. Perhaps, also, he did not include theatrical labours, as they then possessed but little literary dignity. The earlier Shakespeare began to compose for the theatre, the less we are enabled to consider the immaturity and imperfection of a work as a proof of its spuriousness, in opposition to historical evidence, if we only find in it prominent features of his mind. Several of the works rejected as spurious may still have been produced in the period betwixt Titus Andronicus and the earliest of the acknowledged pieces. Quote, at last, Stephens published 7 pieces ascribed to Shakespeare in 2 supplementary volumes. It is to be remarked that they all appeared in print in Shakespeare's lifetime, with his name prefixed at full length. They are the following. Quote 1. Locrine. The proofs of the genuineness of this piece are not altogether unambiguous. The grounds for doubt, on the other hand, are entitled to attention. However, this question is immediately connected with that respecting Titus Andronicus, and must be at the same time resolved in the affirmative or negative. Quote 2. Pericles, Prince of Tyre. This piece was acknowledged by Dryden, but as a youthful work of Shakespeare, it is most undoubtedly his, and has been admitted into several of the late editions. The supposed imperfections originate in the circumstance that Shakespeare here handled a childish and extravagant romance of the old poet Gower, and was unwilling to drag the subject out of its proper sphere. Hence he even introduces Gower himself, and makes him deliver a prologue entirely in his antiquated language and versification. This power of assuming so foreign a manner is at least no proof of helplessness. Quote 3. The London Prodigal. If we are not mistaken, Lessing pronounced this piece to be Shakespeare's, and wished to bring it on the German stage. Quote 4. The Puritan, or the Widow of Watling Street. One of my literary friends, intimately acquainted with Shakespeare, was of opinion that the poet must have wished to write a play for once in the style of Ben Jonson, and that in this way we must account for the difference between the present piece and his usual manner. To follow out this idea, however, would lead to a very nice critical investigation. Quote 5. Thomas, Lord Cromwell. Quote 6. Sir John Oldcastle, first part. Quote 7. A Yorkshire Tragedy. Quote, the 3 last pieces are not only unquestionably Shakespeare's, but in my opinion they deserve to be classed among his best and maturest works. Stephens admits at last, in some degree, that they are Shakespeare's, as well as the others, excepting Locrine, but he speaks of all of them with great contempt, as quite worthless productions. This condemnatory sentence is not, however, in the slightest degree convincing, nor is it supported by critical acumen. I should like to see how such a critic would, of his own natural suggestion, have decided on Shakespeare's acknowledged masterpieces, and what he would have thought of praising in them, had the public opinion imposed on him the duty of admiration. Thomas, Lord Cromwell, and Sir John Oldcastle are biographical dramas, and models in this species, The first is linked from its subject to Henry VIII, and the second to Henry V. The second part of Oldcastle is wanting. I know not whether a copy of the old edition has been discovered in England, or whether it is lost. The Yorkshire tragedy is a tragedy in one act, a dramatized tale of murder. The tragical effect is overpowering, and it is extremely important to see how poetically Shakespeare could handle such a subject. Quote, there have been still farther ascribed to him. First, The Merry Devil of Edmonton, a comedy in one act printed in Dodsley's old plays. This has certainly some appearances in its favour. It contains a merry landlord who bears a great similarity to the one in The Merry Wives of Windsor. However, at all events, though an ingenious, it is but a hasty sketch. Second, The Accusation of Paris. Third, The Birth of Merlin. Fourth, Edward III. Fifth, The Fair Emma. Sixth, Muchedorus. Seventh, Arden of Feversham. I have never seen any of these, and cannot therefore say anything respecting them. From the passages cited, I am led to conjecture that the subject of Muchedorus is the popular story of Valentine and Orson, a beautiful subject which Lope de Vega has also taken for a play. Arden of Feversham is said to be a tragedy on the story of a man from whom the poet was descended by on the mother's side. If the quality of the piece is not too directly at variance with this claim, the circumstance would afford an additional probability in its favour, for such motives were not foreign to Shakespeare. He treated Henry VII., who bestowed lands on his forefathers for services performed by them, with a visible partiality. Whoever takes from Shakespeare a play early ascribed to him, and confessedly belonging to his time, is unquestionably bound to answer, with some degree of probability, this question, who has then written it? Shakespeare's competitors in the dramatic walk are pretty well known, and if those of them who have even acquired a considerable name, a Lilly, a Marlowe, a Heywood, are still so very far below him, we can hardly imagine that the author of a work which rises so high beyond theirs would have remained unknown. End quote. Lectures on Dramatic Literature, Volume 2, page 252. We agree to the truth of this last observation, but not to the justice of its application to some of the plays here mentioned. It is true that Shakespeare's best works are very superior to those of Marlowe or Heywood, but it is not true that the best of the doubtful plays above enumerated are superior or even equal to the best of theirs. The Yorkshire tragedy, in which Schlegel speaks of as an undoubted production of our authors, is much more in the manner of Heywood than of Shakespeare. The effect is indeed overpowering, but the mode of producing it is by no means poetical. The praise which Schlegel gives to Thomas Lord Cromwell and to Sir John Oldcastle is altogether exaggerated. They are very indifferent compositions, which have not the slightest pretensions to rank with Henry V or Henry VIII. We suspect that the German critic was not very well acquainted with the dramatic contemporaries of Shakespeare, or aware of their general merits, and that he accordingly mistakes a resemblance in style and manner for an equal degree of excellence. Shakespeare differed from the other writers of his age, not in the mode of treating his subjects, but in the grace and power which he displayed in them. The reason assigned by a literary friend of Schlegel's for supposing The Puritan or The Widow of Watling Street to be Shakespeare's, namely, that it is in the style of Ben Jonson, that is to say, in a style just the reverse of his own, is not very satisfactory to a plain English understanding. Lochrane and the London Prodigal, if they were Shakespeare's at all, must have been among the sins of his youth. Arden of Feversham contains several striking passages, but the passion which they express is rather that of a sanguine temperament than of a lofty imagination, and in this respect they approximate more nearly to the style of other writers of the time than to Shakespeare's. Titus Andronicus is certainly as unlike Shakespeare's usual style as it is possible. It is an accumulation of vulgar physical horrors, in which the power exercised by the poet bears no proportion to the repugnance excited by the subject. The character of Aaron the Moor is the only thing which shows any originality of conception, and the scene in which he expresses his joy, quote, at the blackness and ugliness of his child begot in adultery, the only one worthy of Shakespeare. Even this is worthy of him only in the display of power, for it gives him no pleasure. Shakespeare managed these things differently. Nor do we think it a sufficient answer to say that this was an embryo or crude production of the author. In its kind, it is full-grown, and its features decided and overcharged. It is not like a first imperfect essay, but shows a confirmed habit, a systematic preference of violent effect to everything else. There are occasional detached images of great beauty and delicacy, but these were not beyond the powers of other writers then living. The circumstance which inclines us to reject the external evidence in favor of this play being Shakespeare's is that the grammatical construction is constantly false and mixed up with vulgar abbreviations, a fault that never occurs in any of his genuine plays. A similar defect and the halting measure of the verse are the chief objections to Pericles of Tyre, if we accept the far-fetched and complicated absurdity of the story. The movement of the thoughts and passions has something in it not unlike Shakespeare, and several of the descriptions are either the original hints of passages which Shakespeare has engrafted on his other plays, or are imitations of them by some contemporary poet. The most memorable idea in it is in Marina's speech, where she compares the world to, quote, a lasting storm, hurrying her from her friends. End of Doubtful Plays of Shakespeare. Our idolatry of Shakespeare, not to say our admiration, ceases with his plays. In his other productions, he was a mere author, though not a common author. It was only by representing others that he became himself. He could go out of himself and express the soul of Cleopatra, but in his own person, he appeared to be always waiting for the prompter's cue. In expressing the thoughts of others, he seemed inspired. In expressing his own, he was a mechanic. The license of an assumed character was necessary to restore his genius to the privileges of nature, and to give him courage to break through the tyranny of fashion, the trammels of custom. In his plays, he was, quote, as broad and casing as the general air. In his poems, on the contrary, he appears to be, quote, cooped and cabined in by all the technicalities of art, by all the petty intricacies of thought and language which poetry had learned from the controversial jargon of the schools, where words had been made a substitute for things. There was, if we mistake not, something of modesty and a painful sense of personal propriety at the bottom of this. Shakespeare's imagination, by identifying itself with the strongest characters in the most trying circumstances, grappled at once with nature and trampled the littleness of art under his feet. The rapid changes of situation, the wide range of the universe, gave him life and spirit, and afforded full scope to his genius. But returned into his closet again, and having assumed the badge of his profession, he could only labor in his vocation, and conform himself to existing models. The thoughts, the passions, the words which the poets pen, glancing from heaven to earth, from earth to heaven, lent to others, shook off the fetters of pedantry and affectation, while his own thoughts and feelings, standing by themselves, were seized upon as lawful prey, and tortured to death according to the established rules and practice of the day. In a word, we do not like Shakespeare's poems because we like his plays. The one and all their excellences are just the reverse of the other. It has been the fashion of late to cry up our author's poems as equal to his plays. This is the desperate cant of modern criticism. We would ask, was there the slightest comparison between Shakespeare and either Chaucer or Spenser as mere poets? Not any. The two poems of Venus and Adonis and of Tarquin and Lucrece appear to us like a couple of ice houses. They are about as hard, as glittering, and as cold. The author seems all the time to be thinking of his verses and not of his subject, not of what his characters would feel, but of what he shall say, and as it must happen in all such cases, he always puts into their mouths those things which they would be the last to think of, and which it shows the greatest ingenuity in him to find out. The whole is labored, uphill work. The poet is perpetually singling out the difficulties of the art to make an exhibition of his strength and skill in wrestling with them. He is making perpetual trials of them as if his mastery over them were doubted. The images, which are often striking, are generally applied to things which they are the least like, so that they do not blend with the poem, but seem stuck upon it, like a splendid patchwork, or remain quite distinct from it, like detached substances painted and varnished over. A beautiful thought is sure to be lost in an endless commentary upon it. The speakers are like persons who have both leisure and inclination to make riddles on their own situation, and to twist and turn every object or incident into acrostics and anagrams. Everything is spun out into allegory, and a digression is always preferred to the main story. Sentiment is built up upon plays of words. The hero or heroine feels not from the impulse of passion, but from the force of dialectics. There is, besides, a strange attempt to substitute the language of painting for that of poetry, to make us see their feelings in the faces of the persons. And again, consistently with this, in the description of the picture in Tarquin and Lucrece, those circumstances are chiefly insisted on, which it would be impossible to convey except by words. The invocation to opportunity in the Tarquin and Lucrece is full of thoughts and images, but at the same time it is overloaded by them. The concluding stanza expresses all our objections to this kind of poetry. Oh, idle words, servants to shallow fools, unprofitable sounds, weak arbitrators, busy yourselves in skill-contending schools, debate when leisure serves with dull debaters. To trembling clients be their mediators. For me, I force not argument a straw, since that my case is past all help of law. The description of the horse in Venus and Adonis has been particularly admired, and not without reason. Round-hoofed, short-jointed, fetlock shag and long, broad breast, full eyes, small head and nostril wide, high crest, short ears, straight legs and passing strong, thin mane, thick tail, broad buttock, tender hide. Look what a horse should have he did not lack, save a proud rider on so proud a back. Now this inventory of perfection shows great knowledge of the horse, and is good matter-of-fact poetry. Let the reader but compare it with a speech in the Midsummer Night's Dream, where Theseus describes his hounds, and their heads are hung with ears that sweep away the morning dew, and he will perceive at once what we mean by the difference between Shakespeare's own poetry and that of his plays. We prefer The Passionate Pilgrim very much to The Lover's Complaint. It has been doubted whether the latter poem is Shakespeare's. Of the sonnets, we do not well know what to say. The subject of them seems to be somewhat equivocal, but many of them are highly beautiful in themselves, and interesting as they relate to the state of the personal feelings of the author. The following are some of the most striking. Constancy. Let those who are in favour with their stars of public honour and proud titles boast, whilst I, whom fortune of such triumph bars, unlooked for joy in that I honour most. Great princes' favourites their fair leaves spread, but as the marigold in the sun's eye, and in themselves their pride lies buried, for at a frown they in their glory die. The painful warrior famoused for fight, after 1,000 victories once foiled, is from the book of honour razed quite, and all the rest forgot for which he toiled. Then happy I, that love and am beloved, where I may not remove, nor be removed. Love's consolation. When in disgrace, with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Novelty. My love is strengthened, though more weak in seeming. I love not less, though less the show appear. That love is merchandised, whose rich esteeming the owner's tongue doth publish everywhere. Our love was new, and then but in the spring, when I was wont to greet it with my lays, as Philomel in summer's front doth sing, and stops his pipe in growth of riper days. Not that the summer is less pleasant now than when her mournful hymns did hush the night, but that wild music burthens every bough, and sweets grown common lose their dear delight. Therefore, like her, I sometimes hold my tongue, because I would not dull you with my song. Life's decay. That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon these boughs which shake against the cold. Bare ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away, death's second self that seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the death-bed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long. In all these, as well as many others, there is a mild tone of sentiment, deep, mellow, and sustained, very different from the crudeness of his earlier poems. End of Poems and Sonnets. End of Characters of Shakespeare's Plays by William Hazlitt, with an introduction by Sir Arthur Quiller Couch.